On an afternoon in December of 1991, a woman in small-town Utah opened up her mailbox. Inside was a credit card bill that was addressed to her husband, who had disappeared a week earlier. And the woman found this to be really strange because, as far as she knew, her husband didn't have a credit card. However, when she finally ripped open the envelope and actually read the charges, she realized that her missing husband might have been keeping an even bigger secret. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you see the Like Button's car at the grocery store, make sure you park your car close enough to theirs so they are not able to open up their driver's side door. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 6:30 p.m. on December 10th, 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff sat inside of a guard shack at the Kennecott Copper Mine in northern Utah, reading a college textbook. The shack was barely big enough for one person to sit inside of, and there were windows on all 4 sides looking out into the total darkness. The sun was already down, and this was a really isolated part of the mine with no lights or other buildings nearby, so apart from a little bit of moonlight on the snow, it was basically pitch black outside. Brian had worked as a security guard for this mine for a little over a year, but he'd only been stationed at this particular guard shack for a couple of weeks now. And in his opinion, it was the worst post he could have been assigned to. His job was to guard this chain link gate on a remote service road that led into the canyons. This was a really out-of-the-way entrance into the mine, which meant that not a lot of vehicles came this way. So the job was basically just really boring. But it was also simultaneously very dangerous. The Kennecott Copper Mine was known as the richest hole on Earth because of the huge amount of valuable materials buried there, including obviously copper and gold and silver. And that made it a big target for thieves. In fact, in just the past few months, more than $150,000 worth of material and equipment had been stolen from the mine. So as a result, Brian was a little bit nervous about being out here in the middle of nowhere. Not only because it was, pitch black outside, but also he was unarmed and there were no security cameras. So if he did encounter thieves, he basically had to handle it by himself, armed with nothing more than a telephone to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been, routine so far, slow and uneventful. So Brian was now just sort of passing the time studying. He was in nursing school and his final exams were coming up in a few days, so he was just sort of poring over his textbooks and notes to prepare. While he studied, he took out his thermos full of soup that he had brought for dinner. And just as he began eating the soup, the phone on his desk rang. Now, Brian immediately did want to answer the phone because he knew very likely it was his wife, Jennifer. But at the same time, right now, things at home were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had also started working nights at the mine to help support the family while he went to nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, it was hard to make ends meet. And now Jennifer was pregnant again with their second child, which was going to make things even harder financially. And the pressure of juggling school and work and parenthood had been putting a big strain on their marriage. And about a month ago, Brian had sort of reached a breaking point, and he'd actually walked out on his family. He'd left a note for Jennifer saying he just needed time alone to think. And then he had driven to his work, he had turned in his security badge and told his boss he quit. Then he had left town, and he'd spent almost a week in Las Vegas. And eventually, he'd driven all the way out to San Francisco. But while he was there, having his time alone, he'd received word that his daughter was in the emergency room with pneumonia back home in Utah. And for Brian, it was like that was his wake-up call. He realized he could not live with himself if he truly abandoned his family. And so he drove right back to Utah to be with Jennifer and to be with his daughter, who would make a recovery. And, Jennifer, she would take Brian back, despite, him walking out on the family, at least for a short time. But her accepting him back into the fold did not sort of make them return to normal. In reality, after he returned, there just was this constant sense that there was tension hanging over their relationship because of what Brian had done, abandoning them. So now, in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath, and then he picked up the ringing phone, and for a few minutes, he just chatted on the phone. Until he suddenly saw something out the window, a flash of headlights coming up the road towards his guard shack. And so at this point, Brian said he had to go, he hung up, and went right outside to meet the approaching vehicle. About an hour and a half later, so around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. The shack's lights were on, but he couldn't see anybody inside of it. And Todd found this pretty odd, because Brian wasn't supposed to leave his post under any circumstance. That was sort of like the main component to the job. You stay put. But making this even stranger was Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. And this shack is so far away from every other building that really there was no way for Brian to go anywhere without his car. Especially not, in the freezing cold like it was that night. So where was Brian? And so Todd, who was definitely feeling a bit apprehensive at this point, he parked his car, he got out, and he walked into the shack. And when he got in there, it's a very small space, but Brian, was not in there. But there was a hat and a half-eaten dinner on the desk inside. And so at this point, Todd felt like, we have an issue. Like, I don't know where Brian is. Something seems off. So he picked up the phone inside the shack, and he called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig drove down a snowy desert road toward the Kennecott copper mine. Now, everybody knew this mine was a target for thieves. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had seemingly vanished into thin air in the middle of his shift, well, Detective Lassig went out right away to investigate, because the thought was, this could have been perpetrated by thieves. Maybe, Brian's been kidnapped or something. When Lassig pulled up to the mine's main entrance, there was another vehicle parked right in front, and it flashed its headlights at him. And then a man in a security guard's uniform rolled down the driver's side window and sort of waved Lassig over. And so Lassig pulled up next to this car, and the man in this other car told Lassig that he was Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had called in about the missing guard. Then after that, Todd started up his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so he did. He followed him off into the darkness, driving down this dark, winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennecott mine was 3 square miles wide, with rocky terrain and mountains on every side. So they were driving for a good 10 minutes before finally Lassig saw this light up ahead, which was the guard shack that Brian had been in. The two men pulled up near this shack and got out of their vehicles. And then Todd told Detective Lassig that this shack was where the guard, Brian Ruff, had last been stationed. And so Lassig, he turned on his flashlight and then aimed it at the ground right outside of the shack. But there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any footprints or tire tracks that might have helped them were now covered up. And so Lassig stepped inside of the shack. And at first glance, everything looked to be in order. There was no blood, nothing overturned, no sign of a struggle. But again, there was a hat, Brian's hat, and also Brian's half-eaten thermos of soup, his dinner, that was still just sitting on the desk, which was pretty conspicuous. And so Lassig is kind of taking the whole scene in, trying to make sense of what could have happened, coming up with maybe some theories here, looking for any clues of where to look next. And as he was doing that, the phone on the desk rang, and Detective Lassig just picked it up, and he asked who was calling. And the woman on the line sounded very surprised, and she said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to reach out to her husband, Brian Ruff. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband Brian had at some point this night left his post and now couldn't be found. And so he was literally looking for her husband. And so he asked Jennifer when was the last time she had spoken to Brian. And Jennifer, she was obviously taken aback by this news, but she said she had just spoken with her husband a couple hours ago. She said they were talking, and then suddenly Brian had to hang up because he said he saw a car coming up the road. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about this particular car that was approaching, or who was driving the car or anything. But Jennifer said no, he didn't say anything, just that the car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was obviously disappointed that there wasn't more information here, but he still thanked Jennifer and told her, I promise I will be in touch with you as soon as I possibly can. I'm gonna go out there and find your husband. Then he hung up the phone and he turned his attention back to the scene, the inside of this very small shack. But just a few seconds after he had put the phone down, the phone rang again. And so Lassig picked it up again, and once again, it was a woman saying she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And she was asking where Brian was, but as Lassig is listening, he's thinking, this woman doesn't sound anything like the woman I just spoke to literally a minute ago who also said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And also, this second woman clearly doesn't have any recollection of the earlier conversation. Like, these are two different people who are both claiming to be Brian's wife, Jennifer. But obviously, there could only be one, so one of these women had to be lying, right? On a morning in mid-December of 1991, so just a few days after Brian Ruff's disappearance from his remote guard shack, and still he had not been found yet, Detective Manny Lassig sat down with a cup of coffee in the Ruff's dining room across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. The investigation had been moving slowly so far because, for the first few days, everyone had been hoping that Brian would just return on his own. But as the days passed and he still hadn't been heard from, that was looking less and less likely. By this point, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, claiming to be his wife, Jennifer. And he had quickly found out that one of those calls was actually from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number, which meant very likely that was the real Jennifer Ruff. But Lassig was still trying to figure out why another woman had called and impersonated her. And also, the timing of the calls was odd. It happened one right after the other. It was just a very strange coincidence. So now, as Lassig sat across from the real Jennifer Ruff, he started out by asking her where she had been on the night Brian disappeared. She told him she had been at the hospital all night working, and then she gave Lassig names of some of her coworkers who could verify that. At this point, Lassig completely pivoted and just asked Jennifer point blank, "Is there any chance your husband could have been having an affair? Were there other women in his life? Was he acting secretive or just odd lately? Anything to indicate, that he was maybe unfaithful?" The reason Lassig asked, obviously, was because of this second woman who he knew had called and pretended to be Brian's wife. He had no idea if the real Jennifer knew, but certainly he did. And the real Jennifer, when she heard this question, she just sort of looked down and then she looked up and she said, "Yes, I am suspicious of that." She told Lassig that she and Brian had been having some real issues in their marriage lately, and in fact, just the previous month, Brian had sort of inexplicably, ran out on the family because he needed time alone, and he was gone and out of contact for that whole time until he just came back begging to be taken back. At this point, Lassig, when he heard that part, he sat back in his chair and wondered if he was just wasting his time on this case to begin with. Because if Brian had previously left and then eventually came back after being totally out of contact, well, what's to say he wasn't doing that right now? What if this was him again, sort of running off to be alone and he would just turn back up again at some point? But Jennifer must have noticed that that's sort of where Lassig's mind was going, because she rushed to add in that, the last time when he ran out for that week, he had left a note for her and even told his boss that he was quitting. There was some warning before he left. She sort of made it dramatic, but he definitely told people before he was going to be gone. In fact, she became insistent that really it was not like Brian to not give warning. For him to just vanish mid-shift like that, like he's done right now, that's not something Brian would do. He's got some faults, but that's not something he would do. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer where Brian had actually gone when he disappeared that first time. And Jennifer answered him by handing him a piece of mail from a nearby table. She explained that it was a credit card bill that had come in the mail that week, and it was addressed to Brian. And she explained that she was pretty confused when she got this because she didn't even know Brian had a credit card. But he apparently did, and he used it while he was away to pay for hotels and meals and other expenses. And so Lassig, he pulled out the bill and began to look it over, and he saw that a lot of the charges were made in Las Vegas and San Francisco. And the amounts that were being charged to restaurants and for room service seemed a bit too large for just one person. He looked up from the bill back at Jennifer, and just from the expression on her face, he knew that they had both drawn the same conclusion. Brian, when he was away for that week, likely had not been alone. Jennifer then grabbed another piece of paper from the counter and gave that to Lassig. This was a phone bill for the family's landline, with a full list of every call that had been made and received in the past month. Jennifer said there were definitely some numbers on this list that she didn't recognize, and she thought maybe one of them could be this person that Brian had been traveling with. And as Lassig looked over this list, one of the phone numbers immediately stood out to him, because that woman who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared and pretended to be Jennifer, basically called right after the real Jennifer, that one, that phone number that was used for the fake Jennifer was the number he was now seeing on this list. Later that same day, Lassig sat down in the living room of the house that was associated with that phone number. And sitting across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kennecott mine where Brian worked. Now, at the moment, Dale wasn't home, but it wasn't really clear when he would get home, and Lassig was really anxious to interview Christy alone, so before her husband got back. So the instant they sat down, Lassig pretty much just cut to the chase. He told Christy that he was nearly positive she and Brian had been having an affair. And then before she could say anything, he pulled out that bill that Jennifer had given him and showed her all the evidence. Christy, when she saw this, for a second looked defiant, but then just broke down and admitted it was true. She said they'd been seeing each other for a while now, and in fact, the month before, they had run away together for about a week. But even though they had ultimately come back and they both went back to their respective families, she said that they had still been very much in touch. Christy said that was the reason she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, just to call and just be in touch with him. That was it. But she said when the person answered and it was a voice that was unfamiliar, it was Detective Lassig, she said that sort of on instinct, she just began to lie and pretended to be Jennifer, Brian's real wife, just so, their affair would not come to light. But Christy made it very clear that she had not heard from Brian since he disappeared, and she had no clue what happened to him. At this point, Lassig sat back on the couch and just looked at Christy, kind of sizing her up. And he thought, she seemed pretty genuinely worried about Brian. And even though the call she had made to the guard shack was ultimately very suspicious and pretty bizarre, her explanation for it did make sense. But at this point, he was certainly not going to rule her out as a suspect quite yet. Also, Lassig knew that Christy's husband, Dale, was also now clearly a primary suspect. Because, if he had found out about this affair, he could have easily hurt Brian in retaliation. The following day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station where Dale was already seated and waiting for him. And the moment Lassig walked in, Dale immediately asked him if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And it seemed to him like Dale's disappointment was genuine, like he was worried about him. Lassig sat down and he asked Dale about how long he'd known Brian for. And Dale said they had met maybe about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they'd become pretty close friends. They'd even hung out together outside of work. At this point, Lassig, almost to catch Dale off guard, he pivoted sort of abruptly and just asked Dale point blank about his wife's affair. And Dale, when he heard that his wife was having an affair, seemed sort of stunned, and he said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. At this point, Lassig just explained to him what his wife had already told him. And Dale appeared genuinely upset. Like, the idea she was cheating on him was horrible, especially with someone he considered clearly to be a close friend. And so as Dale is sort of reacting to this really shocking news, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. And so Dale, who again is sort of like dealing with the shocking news he's just been told, for a moment he just was unable to answer. He ultimately composed himself and he said that actually his car had gotten stuck in the snow while he was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, almost an hour away from the mine. And in fact, he had even had to call a friend to come get him out of the snow. And then he gave Lassig the name of this friend so he could call and confirm it. After taking down this friend's name, Lassig told Dale that he really wanted him to take a polygraph test, and also they would have to search his car. And Dale agreed to both, with no hesitation. One morning, a few weeks later, Lassig walked across a parking lot toward an office building at the Kennecott mine. So far, Brian had still not turned up, and the search for him had been frustrating, because none of the people Lassig had questioned so far had given him any useful information. Dale Bradley, along with his wife, Christy Bradley, had both taken polygraph tests, and both had passed. Lassig had also searched the red Mustang that Dale drove, but there was no evidence in it that linked Dale to Brian's disappearance. Plus, the friend who had helped Dale get his Mustang out of the snow had confirmed he had done that, so his alibi was solid. So at this point, Dale and Christy were sort of unofficially off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the fact that maybe Jennifer, the real Jennifer, so Brian's actual wife, maybe she was involved in her husband's disappearance, despite how, honestly she came across. Now, her coworkers had confirmed she had been at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she could have maybe been working with an accomplice or maybe hired somebody to kill Brian or something. But with no evidence against her and also no body, Brian has not been found here, all Lassig really had here was just a hunch that, maybe she was involved, but who knows. However, just a few days ago, Lassig had received a new lead that sent his investigation in a new direction. That was why he was here right now at the Kennecott mine to speak to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows. So Lassig went inside the building and made his way down the hallway to Todd's office. And when Todd saw the detective, he jumped up and he very eagerly greeted him and said he would do whatever he had to do to try to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told Todd to sit back down. And then Lassig sat down as well, and then he pulled out a tape recorder and he hit record. And then he told Todd why he was there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metal and equipment from the mine and then selling it at pawn shops. In fact, the investigation had discovered that a whole ring of Kennecott employees were involved in these thefts. Todd sort of began to shift in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he was never involved in any of these thefts. And he said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he understood that, and that was not really why he was here. He said when he looked through the records of the investigation about these thefts, he'd found out that Brian had actually been the one who reported some of the thefts that were going on. So now Lassig wondered if maybe on the night of Brian's disappearance, he'd stopped one of his coworkers' vehicles and found stolen materials inside, and maybe they had killed him to keep him quiet. Todd sat back in his chair and looked sort of lost in thought for a moment, and then he admitted that, yeah, that could be possible. He then told Detective Lassig he could actually think of several places on the mine's property where maybe Brian's body was hidden by these, fellow employees if they did this. And then as an example, he suggested the gravel pile by the concentrator, which crushes the minerals and grinds them up. Todd explained that if Brian had been placed there, he would have very likely gotten sucked into the grinders and pulverized with all the other rocks. He'd basically be gone. Detective Lassig was surprised by how specific Todd was being. Todd had really come up with this theory very quickly. So, sensing that Todd might be a little suspicious here, he just let Todd keep going. And Todd did. He just kept spitting out all these theories about maybe what could have happened to Brian, including at one point he said maybe Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles where weeks worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen down and completely covered him up. And he said if that had happened, if Brian had been hidden in a place like that, he would already be buried under several tons of rock at this point, and the police would never find him. On July 10th, 1993, so a year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig drove through a barren desert in Utah about 50 miles south of Kennecott Mine. There had been basically no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours scouring the mine with police dogs and helicopters, looking for any sign that Brian might have been killed or buried or hidden somewhere there. But so far, there was still no trace of Brian. Now, Lassig was confident that there had to have been foul play involved, but it was impossible to prove that when he didn't have a body or evidence that tied any of his suspects to the crime. For months, Lassig's team had looked into every single security guard at the Kennecott mine, especially the ones who had been implicated in that theft ring, but they had ultimately verified that every guard on duty was at their post at the time Brian disappeared. And they'd collected alibis from everyone who was not scheduled to work that night. And so they had not been able to actually link any guards to Brian's disappearance, and that also included Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, who seemed, very eager to offer up these very specific theories. He too was not linked to Brian's disappearance. However, Todd was ultimately linked to that theft ring. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and Christy's husband, Dale, those two, they had alibis, they passed a lie detector test, and really had been ruled out much earlier on in the investigation, and nothing new had come up over the last year to change that, so they were still ruled out. And then as for Brian's wife, Jennifer, Lassig at one point thought maybe she was involved, maybe she had an accomplice or something. She certainly had the motive, to potentially harm her husband. Their marriage was on the rocks, he had clearly been having an affair and she was on to him. But she really had been at work at the time he disappeared, and there was no link from her to any potential accomplice. and so it went nowhere. She was ruled out too. So again, after more than a year, the case basically had gone cold. However, that particular morning, the investigation had been reinvigorated because a group of campers had called in and said they had found skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew this was obviously a long shot, but he was holding out hope that maybe it was Brian. So when he arrived at the location the campers had described, Lassig got out of his car and he walked a short distance across the barren ground to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer to the crime scene, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow grave. The skeleton was clothed in a dust-covered dark blue jacket, and when Lassig crouched down to get a better look, he saw that it was clearly a security guard's uniform. Lassig put on some gloves and then searched the pockets of this jacket, and his fingers immediately landed on a wallet. And when he pulled it out and he looked inside, he found ID cards and credit cards with the name Brian Ruff. Now, at this point, it seemed fairly apparent that the body had to belong to Brian, but because the body was so decomposed, they would have to examine Brian's dental records to definitively ID him, which would take some time. So, while the crime scene techs carefully loaded the remains into a van, Lassig stayed at the scene with the canine unit that was searching for any other evidence nearby. And sure enough, just a few feet away from where the body had been, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells lying in the dirt. It looked like Brian, very likely, had been shot 5 times and then buried in this shallow grave. Then, just a few yards away from the shells, a police dog began barking, and an officer called Lassig over to look at what the dog had found. He walked over, and the officer held up a black work boot, and there was a pretty obvious bullet hole through the leather. And so Lassig figured the boot must have belonged to Brian. But other than this boot and Brian's actual body, 18 months of heat and, wind and sand and snow and rain out in this desert had basically erased any other traces of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig at this point felt very confident that he knew both where Brian was ultimately killed and how he was killed, because of this severe lack of forensic evidence, he was worried that he might not actually be any closer to figuring out who killed Brian. 12 years later, on April 30th, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office got a call from the Sheriff's Department in the next county over. Since the beginning of the year, Detective Park had been working full-time on solving various cold cases. The detective on the line told him that he was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases, specifically the murder of Brian Ruff. After speaking to this detective, Park hung up the phone and went right over to his filing cabinet and dug through until he found Brian's file. He sat down and began sorting through the decade-old papers, and he realized that there was a tiny piece of evidence the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized it was actually the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Brian Ruff on December 10th, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down a winding service road toward a very isolated part of Kennecott Mine. Up ahead, they saw a single light in the distance. It was coming from a small guard shack right next to a chain link gate. The killer pulled right up outside of the shack and parked their car and then got out. And then seconds later, Brian Ruff came out of the guard shack and waved hello. And the killer sort of waved back and walked over to Brian, and then as soon as they were close enough, the killer grabbed Brian, whipped him around, tied his hands behind his back, and then forced Brian, before he could do anything, into the back of the vehicle. At this point, the killer jumped into the driver's seat, did a U-turn, and sped out of the mine towards the desert. And as they were driving, the killer heard Brian screaming and kicking in the back, doing everything he could to try to escape. But the killer was unfazed. They stayed calm and just kept on driving for nearly an hour, all while Brian's acting crazy in back, until they eventually reached another very remote spot way out in the desert about 50 miles away. There, they pulled off the road and they stopped their vehicle right in this open, snow-covered patch of desert. They climbed out, they went to the back seat, and they opened the door up, and they grabbed Brian, who was still fighting and trying to escape. But he was pretty tired at this point, and the killer dragged Brian out. And as they dragged Brian out, Brian began pleading for mercy and promised that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone about this. But the killer just grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then forced him at gunpoint to dig his own grave. And then when Brian was done, the killer just raised their shotgun and shot Brian 5 times. And then after he was dead, they dropped his body into the grave he had literally dug himself, and then the killer got back into their vehicle, a red Mustang. But when the killer tried to leave, their vehicle, the Mustang, got stuck in the snow. And so they had to call a friend who did come out, who had no idea a murder has just been committed literally right over there. There's a body buried, right over there. They didn't know. They helped the killer get out of the snow, and off they drove. The killer was Dale Bradley, the co-worker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that he had been an hour away, his car was stuck in the snow on the night Brian disappeared, well, it was true. Except that wasn't an alibi. He was basically describing being at the crime scene and having another friend come and help him flee the crime scene. But the friend, who absolutely said, "Yup, he was an hour away, I helped him get his car out of the snow," the friend had no idea. This is where a murder has just taken place, and so they told the truth, and Dale sort of acted like, "Yep, that's my alibi," and the police never checked. And so they didn't realize that that wasn't an alibi. It was basically a description of where the crime scene was. Additionally, Dale took a polygraph early on in the investigation, and he did pass it. So he really was dismissed as a suspect very early on. And so Dale and Christy had eventually gotten divorced, likely over the affair, and Dale had ultimately remarried. But when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered in 2005, the detective investigating that murder noticed that Dale had been sort of indirectly connected to now 2 people who had been murdered, Crystal and Brian. And he thought it was suspicious enough that he got in touch with Detective Park, the detective who was in charge of all these cold cases, and he told Park, "Hey, you ought to take a closer look at Dale in the Brian Ruff cold case murder." And so that prompted Detective Park to not just take a closer look at Dale, but really at the whole Brian Ruff case file. And when he did that, he noticed this really small piece of evidence that sort of went overlooked. And that piece of evidence was a tiny speck of red paint on the sole of that black work boot, which had been found near Brian's body out in the desert. And Park was eventually able to match that paint to the same paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was charged with Brian Ruff's murder on September 19th, 2005. In 2007, he pleaded guilty to lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping and was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for Crystal, Dale's second wife who was murdered, her case remains unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Just before midnight on a Tuesday in October 1981, a beige sedan sat idling on the shoulder of a dusty gravel road in South Australia with its orange hazard lights pulsing in the dark. To anyone driving past, it looked like a standard mechanical breakdown, but the driver's side door was wide open and the engine was still running. It was a perfectly functional car with no driver and no sign of trouble. 21-year-old Kyle Aris was a well-liked local resident in the quiet rural town of Kapunda. Kyle had spent his whole life navigating the vast, sun-bleached plains north of Adelaide. He was a physically fit young man who worked various labor jobs on the local sheep stations and was known for being incredibly reliable. On this particular night, Kyle had been visiting some friends in a neighboring town and was making the short, familiar drive back to his family home through the dense scrubland. The road Kyle was traveling was little more than a narrow strip of gravel cutting through miles of private property and dry brush. Around 11:15 that night, a neighbor named Thomas was heading in the opposite direction. As his headlights swept across the brush, he saw Kyle's car parked on the shoulder. The hazard lights were blinking steadily, throwing rhythmic orange flashes against the trees. Thomas slowed down, thinking Kyle might have hit a kangaroo or blown a tire, but as he got closer, he noticed the car was perfectly aligned with the road and there was no debris on the ground. He assumed Kyle had just stepped into the bushes for a moment or was waiting for the dust from a passing truck to settle before continuing. Thomas didn't want to intrude, so he kept driving and headed home to his wife. The evening air was unusually chilly, and a light wind was kicking up small clouds of dust that swirled in the beams of the hazard lights. Inside the car, the heater was still blowing warm air, and a local news broadcast was playing quietly on the radio. Kyle's cigarettes and a lighter were sitting in the center console, and his jacket was draped over the passenger seat. Everything indicated he intended to return in seconds. By 2 in the morning, a local patrol officer spotted the pulsing orange lights from a distance and pulled over to investigate. He found the engine was still humming, though the fuel gauge was hovering near empty. He checked the keys in the ignition and saw Kyle's wallet sitting on the dashboard completely untouched. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, and no footprints leading away from the open door. The officer walked a few paces into the dark scrub, calling Kyle's name, but the only response was the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass. He checked the trunk and under the chassis, thinking Kyle might have been working on a repair and met with a freak accident, but the vehicle was in perfect working order. By 3 in the morning, the police had cordoned off the area and began preparing for a full search. When the sun finally began to rise over the horizon, dozens of volunteers and local officers gathered at the beige sedan. The morning was unusually quiet, and the air was still biting. They divided the surrounding land into grids, moving slowly through the thickets and dry creek beds. About 2 miles from the road, a searcher named Gary noticed a large wooden wool shed sitting on a ridge overlooking the valley. The shed was a weathered structure used during the shearing season, but it was currently supposed to be empty and locked. As Gary approached, he noticed that one of the heavy sliding doors was pushed back about a foot, leaving a dark gap. He knew the owners were away on vacation, so he figured a drifter might be sleeping inside. He signaled to a nearby officer, and together they stepped into the dim interior. The air inside the shed was heavy with the scent of old wood and sheep oil. In the center of the floor sat a massive industrial wool press, a tall steel frame used to compress loose wool into dense square bales. Gary noticed that the metal locking pins on the side of the press were not seated properly. It looked as though the machine had been operated recently and then shut down in a very clumsy hurry. The officer reached for the heavy lever to release the tension on the press. As the hydraulic ram slowly lifted, a dark shape began to emerge from the top of the steel box. It wasn't a bale of wool, it was Kyle. He was curled into a tight ball, forced into the small space by the sheer weight of the machinery. His clothes were torn, and his body showed signs of extreme trauma that no accident could explain. They carefully removed Kyle's body from the machine and laid him on the wooden floor. The medical examiner would later note that he had been beaten severely around the head with a heavy blunt object before being strangled. But the strangest detail was the lack of blood inside the shed. It became clear to investigators that Kyle had been killed somewhere else and then transported to the barn after the fact. Lifting a 200-pound man into the top of a wool press is a massive physical feat. The opening of the press is nearly 5 feet off the ground, and the space inside is extremely narrow. To shove a body inside and then operate the manual levers to compress it would have taken either a person of superhuman strength or more likely a group of multiple people working together in total silence. The investigation immediately focused on the local farming community. Detectives interviewed every shearer and station hand within 50 miles, looking for anyone who had a grievance with Kyle. They looked into the possibility of a random hitchhiker, but the precision required to use that specific model of wool press suggested the killer was someone who was intimately familiar with the equipment in that shed. Kyle's family was devastated and could offer no explanation. He was a young man with a clean record and a wide circle of friends. He wasn't involved in drugs or crime, and he didn't have any debts. The police began to wonder if he had simply seen something he wasn't supposed to see while driving home, leading someone to force him off the road and eliminate him using the closest tools available to them. The logic of the car still didn't make sense to the lead detectives. If someone had snatched Kyle, why would they take the time to turn on his hazard lights? It was a detail that felt almost professional, as if the killer wanted the car to be seen so the police would be occupied with the vehicle while they hid the body. Others felt it was a taunt, a way to ensure the mystery began the moment Kyle vanished. Despite the brutality of the crime, no fingerprints were found on the machine or the car. The heavy dust inside the shed had been disturbed, but there were no clear footprints that could be matched to a specific boot. Kyle's friends were cleared one by one, and the local rumors about a secret cult or a roving gang of killers eventually faded into a heavy, permanent silence that gripped the town for years. The murder of Kyle Arris remains one of the most disturbing, unsolved cases in Australian history. The beige sedan was eventually returned to his family, but the woolshed was torn down by the owners not long after the discovery. No one was ever arrested, and the motive for such a logistical and violent execution remains a mystery. Today, the road is paved, but locals still look for the pulsing lights. This case serves as a reminder that even in the most familiar settings, a simple pullover on the side of the road can lead to something impossible. While the scrubland of South Australia is known for its isolation, our next story takes us to a place that is internationally famous for its beauty, though it hides a secret just as dark. We are moving from the dry heat of the outback to the rolling hills of Tuscany. On a damp, overcast Tuesday in early October 1975, a 35-year-old vineyard foreman named Giovanni moved slowly through the dimly lit cellar of a massive estate in the heart of Tuscany. The annual harvest was at its absolute peak, and for anyone living in the Chianti region, this was the busiest and most profitable time of the year. The air inside the stone building was thick and heavy, carrying the sharp, sweet scent of thousands of pounds of crushed grapes beginning their transformation into wine. Giovanni had spent nearly his entire life working these specific fields. He had started as a seasonal picker when he was just a teenager and had eventually worked his way up to foreman, a position of significant trust and responsibility. He was responsible for the logistics of the entire harvest, from managing the dozens of seasonal workers who arrived on buses every morning to overseeing the precise timing of the fermentation process in the Great Cellar. The cellar itself was a cavernous space with thick stone walls and a floor made of packed earth and gravel. It was filled with rows of massive upright oak vats, each one standing nearly 10 feet tall and held together by thick iron hoops. As Giovanni walked past them, he could hear a faint, rhythmic hissing sound coming from the top of the barrels. This was the carbon dioxide gas escaping as the yeast began to consume the sugars in the grape juice. It was a sound Giovanni found deeply comforting, a sign that the year's work was finally coming to fruition. Around 10 o'clock that night, most of the harvest crew had already left for the local taverns or their boarding houses, leaving the estate quiet. Giovanni told one of the night security guards that he was going to do one final walkthrough of the fermentation room to check the wooden seals on the newest batch of Sangiovese grapes. The guard watched as Giovanni disappeared into the shadows of the cellar, his heavy leather boots crunching softly on the gravel. Giovanni carried a small flashlight and a clipboard intended to record the temperature readings from each vat. It was a completely routine task, something he had done hundreds of times before without incident. When the guard checked the cellar an hour later, he saw Giovanni's clipboard sitting on a small wooden table near the entrance. The flashlight was resting beside it, still turned on its beam, cutting a bright circle into the damp stone wall. The guard assumed Giovanni had simply stepped out to use the restroom, or perhaps had gone to the main office to speak with the estate manager. But as the minutes turned into hours, Giovanni did not return to collect his things. By midnight, the guard began to feel a slight sense of unease, though he quickly rationalized it away. He figured Giovanni was exhausted from the 18-hour workdays and had probably walked back to his small cottage on the edge of the property to get some sleep, forgetting his tools in his fatigue. The harvest was a grueling time, and it wasn't unusual for the senior staff to become forgetful or simply collapse into bed the moment their shift ended. The guard turned off the flashlight, placed the clipboard in a drawer, and finished his rounds. The following morning, the estate was a chaotic hive of activity. Trucks were arriving with fresh crates of grapes, and the seasonal workers were shouting to one another as they began the day's labor. However, Giovanni was nowhere to be found. This was immediately recognized as highly unusual, as Giovanni was typically the first person on the property every morning, often arriving before the sun had even cleared the surrounding hills. The estate manager sent a runner to Giovanni's cottage, but the small house was empty. The bed was neatly made, and there were no signs that anyone had slept there the previous night. By noon, a small search party of local workers began moving through the rows of grapevines and checking the various outbuildings, thinking perhaps Giovanni had tripped and injured himself in the dark. But after several hours, they had found absolutely nothing. For the next 2 days, the harvest continued out of sheer necessity, though a heavy cloud of confusion hung over the winery. Giovanni's absence was felt in every department, but since there was no evidence of foul play, the local authorities were slow to intervene. They suggested that perhaps the pressure of the season had finally gotten to him, and he had simply walked away to start a new life in the city, a common enough occurrence in rural Italy. On the third day after Giovanni vanished, a group of cellar workers were preparing to stir the contents of one of the massive fermentation vats located in the furthest corner of the building. This particular vat had been filled and sealed on the very night Giovanni disappeared. As the men climbed the wooden ladder to reach the top hatch, they noticed a strange dark discoloration around the edge of the heavy oak lid. One of the workers reached out and touched the wooden seal, noticing it felt slightly loose, as if it hadn't been hammered down with the usual precision. He signaled to his partner, and together they used a heavy iron pry bar to pop the lid open. As the seal broke, a massive cloud of carbon dioxide and the pungent smell of fermenting fruit billowed out, forcing the men to turn their heads and cough as they struggled to catch their breath. Once the air cleared, they looked down into the vat. Inside was a thick, bubbling matrix of crushed grapes and purple juice, nearly 5,000 gallons of it. Floating just beneath the surface was a dark, solid shape that didn't belong. One of the men reached in with a long wooden paddle used for stirring and gently pushed the object. As it rolled over in the thick liquid, they saw the sleeve of a heavy canvas work jacket. The workers scrambled down the ladder and ran for the estate manager, who immediately called the local carabinieri. Within an hour, the cellar was cordoned off with yellow tape, and a team of officers arrived to oversee the grim task of draining the vat. They hooked up a series of industrial hoses and began pumping the partially fermented wine into secondary containers, a process that took several hours of agonizingly slow work. As the level of the liquid dropped, the full reality of what had happened became clear. Giovanni's body was resting at the very bottom of the vat, pinned against the wooden slats by the weight of the grapeskins. When the officers finally managed to lift him out, they were met with a forensic nightmare. Giovanni had been submerged in thousands of gallons of highly acidic fermenting grape juice for over 60 hours. The fermentation process is essentially a massive chemical reaction, and the high acidity of the Sangiovese grapes had acted like a slow-moving solvent. His skin was stained a deep, permanent purple, and the chemical environment had effectively scrubbed his body clean of any external DNA hair or fibers that might have been left behind by an attacker. Even his fingerprints had been smoothed away by the constant movement of the skins. Despite the environmental damage, the medical examiner was able to determine a clear cause of death. Giovanni had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck with a sharp, narrow blade before being dumped into the vat. There were no defensive wounds on his hands or arms, which suggested that he had either been attacked from behind or by someone he knew and trusted so completely that he never saw the weapon coming. The Carabinieri focused their investigation on the small, tight-knit community of harvest workers and the winery's permanent staff. They knew that opening and resealing a vat of that size required not only physical strength, but a very specific knowledge of the cellar's equipment. It wasn't something a random intruder could have done in the dark. The killer had to be someone who was supposed to be in that building. Detectives spent weeks interviewing dozens of seasonal laborers, many of whom were drifters or foreign students looking for quick cash. They checked the blood-stained harvest knives of every worker on the property, looking for traces of anything other than grape juice. But the omertà, the traditional code of silence that often grips rural Italian communities, proved to be an insurmountable wall for the investigators. The people who worked the land in Chianti were fiercely private and deeply suspicious of the national police. Even those who liked Giovanni were hesitant to speak, fearing retaliation or simply not wanting to be the one to point the finger at a neighbor. The estate was a complex web of family ties, decades-old grudges, and professional jealousies, all of which remained hidden behind a polite but firm refusal to provide any useful information. The theory eventually emerged that Giovanni had discovered someone skimming from the estate's profits, or perhaps caught a group of workers sabotaging the harvest. In the high-stakes environment of a luxury winery, where a single spoiled batch can cost millions of liras, motives for murder were everywhere. But without physical evidence or a witness willing to break the silence, the case began to grow cold. The vat itself was eventually scrubbed and sanitized, but the estate manager decided to retire it from use, unable to stomach the idea of producing wine in a vessel that had served as a tomb. Giovanni was buried in the local village cemetery, his funeral attended by the very people the police suspected of killing him. To this day, his murder remains a dark, unsolved chapter in the history of the Tuscan Hills. The case of the vineyard foreman serves as a stark reminder of how the most beautiful and romanticized landscapes can provide the perfect cover for a calculated execution. While the acidic grapes of Italy destroyed every trace of a killer, our next story takes us across the globe to a setting that is just as atmospheric, though the crime was solved through a much more modern and tragic set of clues. We are leaving the rolling vineyards of the Mediterranean and heading into the heart of one of the world's most crowded and neon-lit metropolises. In this next case, the horror wasn't hidden in a wooden vat, but inside a row of ordinary metal lockers that thousands of people walked past every single day. This is a story about a social epidemic that shocked a nation and forced a government to change its laws. In the late afternoon of April 16, 1976, a 54-year-old station attendant named Haruki moved through the dense, rhythmic crowds of Shibuya Station in Tokyo. The station was a labyrinth of tiled hallways and neon advertisements, and at this hour, the sound of thousands of commuters' footsteps created a constant low-frequency thrum that Haruki had learned to ignore decades ago. Haruki carried a heavy ring of master keys and a plastic bucket filled with cleaning supplies. Part of his daily routine involved checking the coin-operated lockers that lined the walls of the main transit corridors. These lockers were vital for the city's office workers and travelers, but they were also places where people frequently abandoned items they no longer wanted or simply forgot in their rush. As he reached a specific row of lockers near the western exit, Haruki stopped. He noticed a faint, sweet, and somewhat heavy odor hanging in the air. It wasn't immediately offensive, and Haruki just figured that a commuter had left a bag of groceries or perhaps some fresh fish behind. In the humid spring air of Tokyo, it only took a few hours for food to start turning, so he reached for his master key. He inserted the key into locker number 3 and turned it. The metal door gave a sharp metallic click before swinging open. Inside, Haruki didn't see a bag of groceries. Instead, there was a small bundle wrapped tightly in several layers of the Mainichi Shimbun newspaper, secured with a piece of ordinary household twine. The bundle was tucked all the way into the back corner of the small metal compartment. Haruki reached in and pulled the bundle toward him. It was heavier than he expected, and as he moved, the heavy scent he had noticed earlier became much more concentrated. He set the bundle down on the floor of the station and began to carefully untie the twine. He still believed he was about to find a spoiled cut of meat or perhaps a discarded coat, but as the first layer of newspaper fell away, he stopped moving. Beneath the layers of newsprint and ink, Haruki saw a small, pale hand. He stood up immediately and backed away his bucket of cleaning supplies, clattering against the tiled floor. He didn't scream, but he felt a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. A group of commuters slowed down to see what was happening, but Haruki waved them off his face ashen as he reached for the radio on his belt to call for the station police. Within 20 minutes, a 42-year-old detective named Sato arrived at the scene. He had spent 15 years with the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and had seen the city's darker side, but the sight of the small locker made him pause. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and the constant flow of commuters had been diverted around the row of metal boxes. Sato knelt beside the bundle and began the methodical work. As Sato carefully unfolded the remaining layers of newspaper, he confirmed that it was a newborn infant. There were no visible signs of trauma or violence on the body, which suggested the child had likely died of exposure or had been stillborn. Sato looked around the empty locker, hoping to find a note or a piece of clothing that might lead him to a suspect, but the metal box was almost entirely empty except for one small, mundane item. Lying in the dust at the very back of the locker was a small key tag. It was made of cheap red plastic with a handwritten number on one side and a name on the other. The name belonged to a low-income boarding house located several miles away in a district known for its small, cramped apartments and transient population. Sato bagged the tag, realizing that this tiny piece of plastic was his only real link to whoever had been there. The following morning, Sato drove to the address on the key tag. The boarding house was a narrow, weathered building squeezed between two much larger warehouses. The air there was thick with the smell of industrial exhaust and cooking oil. Sato went inside and showed his badge to the elderly woman running the front desk. When he held up the red key tag, the woman's expression shifted from confusion to a subtle, heavy realization. She told Sato that the tag belonged to a room on the third floor, currently occupied by a 22-year-old woman named Yumi. Sato climbed the narrow, creaking staircase and knocked on the door to room 302. After a long silence, the door opened a few inches. A young woman with hollow eyes and a very thin frame stood there. She looked as though she hadn't slept or eaten in days, and when she saw Sato's badge, she didn't try to run. Yumi invited the detective into her room, which was little more than a small mat on the floor and a single window overlooking an alley. She sat down and began to speak in a low, flat voice. She explained that she had come to Tokyo for work, but had found herself unemployed and pregnant. In 1976, the social stigma surrounding unwed mothers in Japan was absolute, and Yumi had no family to turn to and no money for a hospital. She told Sato that after the child was born in the room, she had panicked. She felt that she couldn't keep it and couldn't leave it, so she had wrapped the infant in the only thing she had, yesterday's newspaper. She had walked to Shibuya Station and placed the bundle in a locker, thinking that in such a busy place, someone might find it and help. She didn't seem to realize that a locker was a tomb, not a cradle, until Sato told her the outcome. Yumi was arrested and eventually charged with abandonment, resulting in death. Her case, however, became a massive cultural flashpoint in Japan. It exposed a hidden epidemic of locker babies where hundreds of desperate women were doing the exact same thing because they felt they had no other choice. The government was forced to take action, installing ventilation in public lockers and revolutionizing the country's reproductive support systems. Today, Shibuya Station is even more crowded than it was in 1976, and the rows of coin lockers are still there, utilized by millions of people. But the red key tags and the newspaper bundles are gone, replaced by digital locks and social safety nets that didn't exist for Yumi. While this case was a social tragedy on a local scale, our next story involves a crime that took place in the heart of power involving a global conspiracy. Around 9 in the morning on September 21st, 1977, a 45-year-old man named Arthur Varga pulled his dark blue luxury sedan away from a curb in a quiet residential neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Arthur was a tall, distinguished-looking man who usually wore tailored suits and spoke with a soft, measured accent that hinted at his years spent in the highest levels of international diplomacy and politics. Sitting in the passenger seat was his 26-year-old colleague, Sarah Miller. Sarah was an energetic activist who had spent the last year working closely with Arthur on various human rights projects. As they moved through the morning traffic, they were both sipping coffee and going over their notes for a meeting they had scheduled at their office just a few miles away in the city's diplomatic district near the heart of the crammed capital. The weather was perfect for late September. The air was crisp and cool, and the trees lining the wide avenues of Embassy Row were just starting to turn gold and orange. Arthur felt particularly relaxed that morning. Despite his history of political tension back in his home country, he had come to view the streets of the American capital as a sanctuary where he could speak his mind without looking over his shoulder or fearing any form of retaliation. Sarah was talking about a report. They were finalizing her voice, competing with the low hum of the car's engine. She reached into her leather bag to pull out a folder, adjusting her seatbelt as she did. Arthur nodded along, occasionally checking his rearview mirror, but he was mostly focused on the rhythmic stop and go of the morning commute. To anyone watching, they looked like two professionals heading into just another busy Wednesday. As Arthur approached a grand leaf-strewn roundabout known as Sheridan Circle, he slowed down to merge into the flow of cars. He was focused on a pedestrian crossing the street and did not notice a small, nondescript gray sedan that had been following him at a distance for several blocks. Inside that car, a man watched Arthur's vehicle enter the center of the circle before he reached down and flipped a single toggle switch on a small plastic box. A massive explosion tore through the bottom of Arthur's car, centered directly underneath the driver's seat. The force of the blast was so violent that it lifted the multi-ton luxury vehicle several feet into the air. The fuel tank ignited instantly, turning the car into a tumbling ball of orange flame and shredded metal that skidded across the pavement before coming to a stop in the middle of the diplomatic roundabout right in front of an embassy. Bystanders who had been walking to work or waiting at bus stops froze in place as the sound of the blast echoed off the stone buildings like a clap of thunder. For several seconds, the only noise was the crackling of the fire and the sound of heavy debris falling back onto the road like rain. A thick cloud of black smoke rose into the clear morning sky, visible from the windows of several nearby embassies and even the upper floors of the White House. When the first group of witnesses reached the wreckage, they found that the driver's side of the car had essentially been hollowed out by the upward force of the device. Arthur Varga had been killed instantly when the floor pan was driven upward into his torso. His lower body was gone, and his upper half was slumped over the steering column, which had been bent into a jagged shape. Sarah Miller had also been killed by a shard of metal that hit her neck. Forensic teams in white coats arrived within the hour and began the slow process of sifting through the charred remains of the sedan. At first, there was intense speculation among the local police that the explosion might have been caused by a massive mechanical failure or perhaps a localized extremist group. It seemed impossible to many that a professional hit squad would carry out such a high-profile execution in broad daylight in the U.S. Capitol. The investigators spent hours on their hands and knees picking through the glass and blackened metal. They noticed that the damage was highly localized, concentrated in a perfect circle beneath where Arthur's feet would have been. This wasn't the signature of a fuel tank explosion. A fuel tank failure usually causes the rear of the car to bloom outward. This was a shaped charge designed to focus all of its energy upward into a specific human target. However, as the FBI took over the investigation, they discovered small fragments of a highly specialized electronic detonator that was not commercially available in the United States. They also found traces of a specific grade of high-output plastic explosive often used by military intelligence agencies in South America. This new evidence broke the theory of an accidental fire and pointed toward a much larger, more sophisticated international conspiracy. Investigators began tracking the movements of known foreign agents who had entered the country in the weeks leading up to the bombing. They eventually discovered a trail of phony passports and safe houses that stretched from New York City down to the southern tip of the continent. It was a massive international manhunt that slowly pulled back the curtain on a secret program known as Operation Condor, run by the secret police of a foreign dictatorship. They found that a team of 3 men had been tracking Arthur for months. They had rented an apartment in a nearby suburb and spent their days mapping out his morning routine. They knew exactly when he left his house, which route he took to the office, and where he usually slowed down for traffic. They had waited for the perfect moment at Sheridan Circle because the curve of the road forced Arthur to slow down to a crawl, making the remote trigger reliable. The FBI eventually identified the bomb makers and the agents who had triggered the device. They were members of a specialized hit squad known as DINA, sent specifically to silence Arthur Varga because of his loud and public criticisms of his home country's leadership. He was a diplomat in exile who was becoming too influential on the world stage, and the dictatorship decided that even the streets of Washington, D.C. were not off limits for an execution. The discovery sent shockwaves through the American government. It was a terrifying realization that a foreign power had successfully smuggled a hit squad and military-grade explosives into the heart of the U.S. Capitol to carry out a political assassination. Security protocols for foreign diplomats were completely overhauled, and the incident led to a massive diplomatic standoff that lasted for years as the U.S. demanded the extradition of those responsible. The men responsible for the bombing were eventually tracked down across various borders. Some were arrested in safe houses, while others were turned over by their own governments after political regimes changed. They were eventually convicted in international courts, though the high-ranking officials who had authorized the hit squad remained protected by their government for decades, living in luxury, while the families of Arthur and Sarah waited for justice. The luxury sedan was eventually hauled away to a secure warehouse where it remained as evidence for 30 years. The roundabout at Sheridan Circle was cleaned, and the scorch marks on the pavement were eventually paved over. Today, a small plaque sits near the site, tucked away among the leaves, marking the spot where the quiet of a September morning was shattered. Arthur's death became a symbol of the lengths a regime will go to stay in power. Arthur's wife would later tell reporters that he always felt the most free when he was driving through D.C., believing that the laws of the United States acted as a physical shield around him. He didn't realize that the men following him didn't care about borders or laws. While this crime was an act of high-stakes international espionage, our next story involves a mystery that is far more quiet and eerie, taking us to the isolated roads of the Australian outback. In the midwinter of 1981, a 23-year-old university student named Elias Backer stood on the sidewalk outside a crowded apartment building in Utrecht, holding his car keys and exhaling a plume of white steam into the night air. The party inside was still going strong, with music thumping through the brick walls, but Elias had a long drive ahead of him, and he wanted to get a head start before the weather turned worse. Earlier that evening, the local news had predicted a heavy frost, but as Elias looked down the street, he noticed that a thick white fog had already begun to roll in from the surrounding lowlands. It was the kind of dense North Sea mist that seems to swallow light, turning the street lamps into blurry yellow smudges. Elias checked his watch and saw it was just after 10:30. He figured if he left now, he could be back in his own bed in Rotterdam by midnight. He walked over to his car, which was parked under a leafless oak tree. It was a 1972 Volkswagen Beetle, and Elias had spent the better part of a year restoring it. He had chosen a very specific shade of paint for the exterior, a brilliant, high-visibility clementine orange. He often joked with his roommates that his car was impossible to lose in a parking lot because it practically glowed even in the dimmest light of a Dutch winter. Elias climbed into the driver's seat and felt the cold plastic of the steering wheel through his wool gloves. The interior of the Beetle was cramped, but familiar smelling of old upholstery and engine oil. He turned the key, and the air-cooled engine behind him sputtered to life with its characteristic rhythmic chugging sound. He let the heater run for a few minutes, watching the frost melt off the curved windshield before he shifted into gear and pulled away. As he reached the outskirts of Utrecht, the visibility dropped significantly. The fog was no longer just a mist, it had become a solid wall of white that clung to the hood of his orange car. In the Netherlands, many of the secondary roads running between major cities are built directly alongside deep drainage canals. These waterways are a fundamental part of the landscape, but on a night like this, they were a constant presence just a few feet from the shoulder. Elias was a careful driver who had navigated these roads hundreds of times. He knew that the key to driving in the lowlands was to watch the white lines on the pavement and listen for the sound of his tires on the damp asphalt. He turned his radio to a low volume, listening to a late-night jazz program, and settled into a steady 30-mile-per-hour crawl. To Elias, the silence of the fog felt peaceful, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. By 1 a.m, Elias's mother, Martha, woke up in her home in Rotterdam and noticed that the light under her son's bedroom door was still dark. Elias was always punctual, and he had promised to call her once he arrived back at his apartment after the university gathering. Martha sat in the kitchen and waited, telling herself that the fog had simply forced him to pull over at a rest stop or stay overnight with a friend to wait for the sun to rise. When the sun finally did come up the next morning, the fog had lifted to reveal a world coated in a layer of sparkling white frost. However, Elias's orange Beetle was not in its usual parking space, and his apartment remained empty. Martha began calling his friends in Utrecht, and they all confirmed that Elias had left the party around 10:45. They described him as sober, alert, and looking forward to the drive home in his newly painted car. By noon, the Dutch National Police had officially listed Elias as a missing person. Their primary theory was straightforward and based on decades of experience in the region. They assumed that in the near-zero visibility of the previous night, Elias had misjudged a sharp turn or been blinded by the headlights of an oncoming truck, causing him to veer off the road and plunge into one of the deep canals that lined his projected route to Rotterdam. The search operation was massive. Because the orange Beetle was so distinctive, investigators believed it would be easy to spot if even a small part of it was sticking out of the water. They deployed dive teams to every major intersection and bridge along the highway. They used long weighted poles to probe the muddy bottoms of the canals, looking for the solid resistance of metal. They spent 3 days dredging miles of waterway, but they found nothing. The police then escalated the search by bringing in the Royal Netherlands Navy. They used advanced side-scan sonar equipment, which is designed to create high-resolution images of the seafloor. The sonar was dragged behind small boats, scanning every inch of the canals that were deep enough to swallow a vehicle. They located several old bicycles, a discarded safe, and even a sunken rowing boat from the 1950s, but there was no sign of an orange beetle. This was the point where the investigation hit a logical wall. A bright orange car is not a subtle object. If it had gone into the water, there should have been tire tracks in the soft mud of the canal bank, or perhaps a broken fence or disturbed reeds. But along the entire 60-mile stretch of road between Utrecht and Rotterdam, the landscape was completely undisturbed. It was as if Elias and his car had simply evaporated into the white mist. The case remained stagnant for nearly 3 weeks until a clerk at a small bank in the town of Zwolle noticed something unusual. Zwolle was located in the opposite direction of Elias's intended route, nearly 50 miles north of Utrecht. The clerk reported that someone had used Elias's bank card to withdraw a small amount of cash from an automated teller machine. At that time, bank surveillance was primitive, and the footage was too grainy to identify the person. Investigators were baffled by this development. Elias had no reason to be in Zwolle, and he certainly didn't have any friends or family in that part of the country. Even more confusing was the fact that the withdrawal had occurred 4 days after he vanished. This shattered the theory that he had died in a tragic car accident on the night of the fog. It suggested that Elias was either alive and traveling, or that someone had taken his wallet and his car. The police began to look into Elias's personal life with much more scrutiny. They questioned his professors and his fellow students, looking for any sign that he had been unhappy or was planning to drop out of school. But everyone described him as a high achiever who was deeply invested in his studies. He had no history of mental health issues, no debt, and no secret relationships that would have caused him to abandon his life so abruptly. They also looked into the possibility of a random hijacking. Perhaps Elias had stopped to help someone in the fog, and they had forced him to drive north before eliminating him. But even that theory didn't explain the car. In a country as densely populated and tightly mapped as the Netherlands, hiding a bright orange Volkswagen Beetle for weeks is nearly impossible. Every road is patrolled, and every neighborhood has eyes on the street. Despite the bank lead, no further activity was ever recorded on Elias's accounts. The trail in Zwolle went entirely cold. The police conducted a second round of canal searches during the spring thaw, thinking the shifting ice might have moved the vehicle, but again, they found nothing. Elias Bakker and his Clementine orange car became a permanent fixture on the National Missing Persons List, a riddle that defied the basic laws of physics and logistics. Decades passed, and the case of the vanishing beetle transitioned from an active investigation into a piece of modern Dutch folklore. Every few years, a new detective would pick up the file and re-examine the bank records or the sonar logs, but the conclusion remained the same. There was no physical evidence of an accident, no body, and no vehicle. It was an impossible disappearance that seemed to have begun and ended in the silence of the frost. Elias's mother kept his room exactly as it was on the night he left for Utrecht, waiting for a knock at the door that never came. She would later tell local reporters that she didn't mind the mystery as much as she minded the silence. The logic of the world told her he was gone, but the lack of a car or a crash site allowed her to imagine he was still out there driving through a fog that never lifted. Elias Bakker is still officially missing today. The disappearance of the orange beetle serves as a reminder that the most vibrant and visible objects can still be lost in a moment of environmental chaos. While the Dutch canals kept their secrets hidden through depth and mud, our next case involves a mystery that was solved not by searching the water, but by listening to the persistent voices of those who refused to let the truth stay. Buried. We are moving from the lowlands of Holland to the highways of France. In this next story, a series of disappearances along a single transit corridor remained unsolved for nearly 40 years. The authorities had long ago given up, but an alliance of grieving mothers decided to take the investigation into their own hands. They would eventually uncover a phantom who had been hiding in plain sight using a modern highway as a hunting ground for decades. It is a story about the power of persistence against a broken system. In the late evening of December 17, 1986, a 21-year-old woman named Chloe Bissett stepped out of a friend's house in the small village of Blanzy. The air in the Saône-et-Loire region of France was biting and damp, typical for early winter, and a light mist was beginning to settle over the surrounding vineyards. Chloe pulled her coat tight, said her goodbyes, and began the short walk back to her family home. The path Chloe took was one she had traveled hundreds of times. It ran parallel to a stretch of the A6 highway, a massive transit corridor that connected Paris to the south. At that hour, the distant hum of long-haul trucks was the only sound in the valley. Chloe liked the walk because it gave her time to think. She was a responsible girl, and she had promised her mother, Maria Rossi, that she would be home by midnight. As Chloe walked, she noticed a pair of headlights slowing down on the small access road nearby. She didn't think much of it at first. In a small town, people often slowed down to see if a neighbor needed a lift or just to be cautious in the fog. Chloe kept her head down, her boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. She was less than a mile from her front door when the car came to a complete stop about 50 yards ahead of her. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out into the mist. Chloe slowed her pace, assuming the driver was lost and looking for directions to the highway. This was a common occurrence for locals living near the A6. She watched as the man reached back into his vehicle, pulling out a long, narrow object. Chloe figured it was a map or perhaps a flashlight. She continued walking toward him, intending to be helpful and get back to the warmth of her house. She was only a few feet away when she noticed the man wasn't holding a map, he was holding a knife. Before Chloe could process the logic of the situation, the man moved with a rhythmic, practiced speed. He didn't say a word as he drove the blade into her torso. Chloe tried to scream, but the cold air and the sudden shock of the steel caused her breath to catch. The man continued the motion, stabbing her more than 100 times in a matter of minutes. He moved with the casual efficiency of someone performing a repetitive task at a factory. When Chloe finally stopped moving, the man stood up and wiped his forehead, exhaling a cloud of steam into the night. He didn't look around to see if there were witnesses. He simply picked up Chloe's bag, tossed it into the bushes, and climbed back into his car. He drove away slowly, his taillights fading into the fog as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. By 1 a.m, Maria Rossi was sitting in her kitchen, staring at the clock. Her daughter was never late. Maria walked to the front door and looked out into the darkness, telling herself that Chloe had likely decided to stay overnight at her friend's house because of the weather. It was the most logical explanation. She went back to the table, poured a glass of water, and decided to wait another hour. She didn't want to be the overprotective mother. When the sun rose the next morning and Chloe still hadn't appeared, Maria called the friend's house. The voice on the other end was confused. Chloe had left hours ago. Maria felt a cold, hollow sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. She hung up and immediately went to the local police station. She told the officers that her daughter was missing, but the response she received was one of practiced bureaucratic indifference. The officers explained to Maria that 21-year-old girls often decided to hop on a train to Paris or Lyon without telling their parents. They said Chloe was an adult and had the right to disappear if she wanted to. Maria tried to explain that Chloe was a vocational student with no money and no reason to leave, but the police simply took a description and told Maria to go home and wait for a phone call. They didn't even send a patrol car to the village. For the next several days, Maria and a few neighbors conducted their own search. They walked the path between the two houses, calling Chloe's name into the empty fields. On the fourth day, Maria noticed a small, colorful object snagged on a bramble bush near a drainage ditch along the access road. It was Chloe's scarf. Maria knelt down to pick it up, and that was when she saw her daughter's body lying at the bottom of the ditch, partially covered by leaves. The discovery forced the police to act, but the investigation was clumsy from the start. Investigators noted the extreme violence of the crime, but they immediately theorized that the killer must be a drifter or a truck driver passing through on the A6. It was a theory that required no local knowledge and very little legwork. They assumed the killer was hundreds of miles away by now, and because they found no fingerprints or witnesses, the file was soon shelved. But Maria Rossi refused to let the silence settle. She began looking into other cases in the region and discovered something that the police had failed to mention. Chloe wasn't the only one. Since the mid-1970s, several other young women had vanished or been found dead along that same stretch of the A6 highway. The local media had even started using a name for the area. They called it the Triangle of Dead Girls. Maria realized that a phantom was operating in the Saône-et-Loire, using the highway as a hunting ground. She reached out to the families of the other victims, and together they formed an association. They spent their weekends meeting in cramped basements, sharing police reports and photos of their daughters. They were a group of grieving mothers who had been told by the state to move on, but they decided they were going to do the police's job for them. The association spent the next 20 years lobbying the French Ministry of Justice. They wrote thousands of letters and held protests outside the courthouses. Every time a new prosecutor was assigned to the region, Maria was there at their office on the first day, handing them Chloe's file. She insisted that the physical evidence from the crime scene, including Chloe's clothing, be preserved in a climate-controlled facility, despite the high cost to the state. By the early 2000s, forensic science had begun to catch up with Maria's persistence. New DNA technology allowed investigators to extract profiles from tiny skin cells or hairs that had been invisible decades earlier. In 2014, nearly 30 years after Chloe was killed, a lab in Lyon successfully isolated a male DNA profile from a small stain on the sleeve of Chloe's coat. The profile was run through the National Criminal Database. The system returned a match almost immediately. The DNA didn't belong to a mysterious drifter or a long-haul trucker from another country. It belonged to a 56-year-old man named Paul Jerry. Paul lived in a small, quiet house in the same region only a few miles away from where Chloe had been found. He was a married man with a daughter of his own, and he worked as a gardener for the local municipality. He was a man everyone knew. When the police arrived at Paul's house to arrest him, they found him in his backyard, carefully pruning a row of rose bushes. He looked up at the officers with a calm, almost bored expression. He didn't try to run or deny his identity. As they led him to the patrol car, his neighbors stood on their porches looking on in total confusion. They described Paul as a polite, helpful man who never missed a day of work and was always home by dinner. In the interrogation room, Paul's casual demeanor didn't break. He told the detectives that on the night of December 17, 1986, he had simply been feeling restless. He said he had driven out to the access road to clear his head when he saw Chloe walking alone. He explained the murder as if he were recounting a trip to the grocery store. He said he didn't know Chloe personally, but she was there and he had his work knife in the car. The reveal sent a shockwave through the Saône-et-Loire. The Phantom of the A6 hadn't been a ghost passing through the night. He was a neighbor who had spent the last 3 decades attending local festivals, paying his taxes, and raising a family right under the noses of the investigators. Paul Jerry had watched as Maria Rossi pleaded for justice on the evening news, and then he had gone back to tending his garden and eating dinner with his wife. The trial of Paul Jerry took place in 2017. Maria Rossi sat in the front row every single day, staring at the back of the man who had ended her daughter's life. Paul remained largely silent during the proceedings, only speaking to confirm minor details of his mundane life. He was eventually convicted of the murder of Chloe Bisset and was linked to several other disappearances in the Triangle of Dead Girls. He was sentenced to life in prison. As Paul was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he didn't look at the families of the victims. He kept his eyes on the floor, his face as unexpressive as it had been on the night he stood in the fog with a knife. Maria Rossi stood outside the courthouse and spoke to the gathered reporters. She didn't talk about vengeance. She talked about the weight of the files she had carried for 30 years and how finally she could put them down. The Association of Mothers eventually disbanded, having achieved the impossible through sheer stubborn will. The A6 highway remains a busy transit route, but the sodium lights now feel a little less lonely to the people living nearby. Chloe's grave in Blanzy is often covered in fresh flowers, a quiet monument to a girl whose mother refused to let her be forgotten by a system that preferred the easy answer of a passing shadow. Maria Rossi would later say that the most frightening part of the ordeal wasn't the mystery of the highway, but the realization of how normal Paul Jerry actually was. He had no criminal record and no history of mental illness. He was just a man who made a choice one Tuesday night. While the persistence of a mother solved a decades-long mystery in France, our next story takes us to the ancient ruins of a different continent. In this next case, the darkness didn't come from a highway, but from the crumbling stone of a historic temple in Thailand. It involves a midnight watchman who took his job too seriously and a group of men who were willing to kill for a piece of the past. It is a story about how a single anonymous tip and a shipping crate in Bangkok finally exposed a global criminal syndicate that had been operating in the shadows for years. On a moonlit night in August 1977, a 54-year-old night watchman named Prasert moved slowly through the sprawling ruins of the Ayutthaya Historical Park in central Thailand. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and jasmine, a common weight in the humidity of the monsoon season. Prasert had walked these stone paths for nearly 20 years, and the massive, headless stone Buddhas felt like old friends. His routine was as predictable as the tides. He carried a heavy iron flashlight and a small wooden baton, though he rarely had to use either. Occasionally, he would chase off a stray dog or a group of curious teenagers who had stayed past the park's closing time, but for the most part, his nights were spent in a comfortable, heavy silence. At around midnight, Prasert stopped to sit on a crumbling brick ledge to take a drink of water. As he capped his bottle, he noticed that the cicadas, which usually provided a constant deafening soundtrack to his shift, had suddenly gone silent in the direction of the main temple. To a stranger, this might have seemed like a trick of the wind, but Prasert knew the park's rhythm. He stood up and adjusted his belt, listening. From the shadows of the 14th century pagoda ahead, he heard a rhythmic, metallic, clinking sound. His first thought was that a structural support had finally given way. The ruins were ancient and fragile, and the recent heavy rains often caused stones to shift. He clicked on his flashlight and began walking toward the source of the noise. As he rounded the corner of the stone altar, the beam of his light caught the reflection of something bright and yellow. He assumed it was a piece of discarded brass, but the logic didn't hold. Standing in the center of the temple were three men dressed in dark utilitarian clothing. They weren't teenagers, and they didn't look like locals. They were using heavy industrial chisels and a pneumatic pry bar to hack a solid gold Buddha relic out of its protective stone casing. The statue was a priceless artifact from the 13th century, and the men were working with a practiced, brutal efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time. Prasert opened his mouth to shout, intending to tell them to stop, but before he could make a sound, the man nearest to him dropped his chisel and moved with a sudden jerky speed. He didn't use a gun. He swung a heavy iron bar into the side of Prasert's head. The night watchman fell to the stone floor, his flashlight rolling away and casting long, erratic shadows across the faces of the headless stone statues that surrounded them. The men didn't panic. They didn't even stop their work. While one man stood over Prasert, the other two continued to chip away at the base of the golden relic. They worked for another 20 minutes until the statue finally groaned and tilted forward. Once the gold was free, they dragged Prasert's body toward a historic stone pillar. They used thick nylon rope to tie him to the column, wrapping it tightly around his chest and his neck. They stuffed a piece of industrial rags into his mouth and secured it with silver duct tape. One of the men leaned in close to Prasert, who was still alive, but barely conscious, and checked the tightness of the knots. He seemed satisfied. The man then picked up a narrow work blade and drove it into Prasert's torso twice, a casual gesture to ensure the watchman wouldn't be able to provide a description to the police if he were found early. After the watchman stopped moving, the men hoisted the solid gold relic onto a heavy-duty trolley they had brought with them. They wheeled it out of the ruins through a gap in the perimeter fence and loaded it into a nondescript white van. They drove away slowly, keeping their headlights off until they reached the main road. The only evidence they left behind was a few dark tool marks on the stone altar and the cooling body of Prasert. Early the next morning, a group of monks arrived at the temple to perform their daily prayers. They found the heavy iron flashlight first sitting in a puddle of water. When they followed the trail of disturbed dust into the main pagoda, they saw Prasert tied to the pillar. The monks would later tell investigators that the most striking detail wasn't the blood, but the way Prasert looked like he was part of the stone ruins themselves. The Royal Thai police arrived by 8 in the morning and immediately realized the scale of the crime. The solid gold Buddha was a national treasure, and its disappearance was a massive embarrassment to the local authorities. The lead detective, a man named Viroj, noted the professional nature of the theft. The stone casing had been opened with surgical precision, suggesting the killers had access to high-end construction equipment. Initially, Varoj's theory was that the crime was the work of local thieves who had grown desperate due to the regional economic downturn. He ordered a sweep of every pawnshop and scrap metal yard in the province, looking for anyone trying to melt down large quantities of gold. However, as the days turned into weeks, no gold surfaced. The local underworld was silent, and the trail at the Ayutthaya ruins began to go cold. Varoj began to rethink his strategy. A relic of that size and historical importance wouldn't be melted down for its weight in gold. It would be sold to a private collector for millions. This meant the killers weren't just thieves. They were part of a logistics network capable of moving stolen artifacts across international borders. He reached out to customs officials and art historians searching for similar heists in Southeast Asia. 3 weeks after the murder, an anonymous tip was called into a police substation in Bangkok. The caller spoke in a low-rushed voice and gave the address of a hidden warehouse in an industrial district near the shipping docks. The caller claimed that a shipment of garden replicas was being prepared for export to Western Europe and that the contents of one specific crate were far older than the paperwork suggested. Varoj and a tactical team arrived at the warehouse just after midnight. The building was a massive corrugated metal structure filled with rows of wooden shipping crates. The air inside was hot and smelled of sawdust and treated lumber. They found the logistics manager, a 40-year-old man who looked remarkably calm, sitting in a small office near the back. He handed over the shipping logs without any sign of hesitation. He pointed Varoj toward a massive crate labeled as a modern stone garden replica. Varoj ordered his team to use crowbars to pry the lid off. As the nails groaned and the wood splintered, a heavy metallic scent wafted out of the crate. It wasn't the smell of fresh stone. Beneath layers of bubble wrap and industrial foam, they found the 13th century golden Buddha. It was sitting upright, gleaming in the warehouse lights. As Varoj reached out to touch the relic, he noticed a series of dark reddish-brown stains near the base of the statue. It was blood. The killers had been in such a hurry to package the relic that they hadn't bothered to clean it after the execution of the night watchman. Forensic tests later confirmed that the DNA matched Prassert. The presence of the blood inside a sealed export crate provided the final link between the theft and the murder. The logistics manager was arrested on the spot. Under questioning, his calm demeanor finally broke. He confessed that he worked for an international art smuggling syndicate that targeted ancient temples. He claimed he didn't know who the actual killers were, as they had simply dropped the statue off at his loading dock in a white van. However, his phone records led investigators to a series of safe houses used by the hit squad. The discovery exposed a shadow syndicate that had been systematically looting Thailand's history for years. While the men who had actually struck the blow against Prassert were never identified, the dismantling of their logistics network crippled the organization's ability to operate in the region. The gold Buddha was returned to Ayutthaya under heavy armed guard, where it was eventually placed back in a high-security stone casing. The logistics manager was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. Prassert's family was given a small pension by the state, and a small shrine was built near the pillar where he was found. The monks who found him still leave fresh jasmine at the site every morning. To them, he isn't just a victim of a heist, he is the final guardian of the temple who stayed at his post until the end. Varoj would later tell his colleagues that the most disturbing part of the case was the crate itself. It had been professionally packed, insured, and ready to be shipped across the globe as if it were a common piece of furniture. The blood on the gold was the only thing that didn't fit the paperwork. While the ruins of Thailand eventually gave up their secrets, our next story takes us to a crowded transit hub in the heart of London. In this next case, the mystery didn't take place in the quiet of a stone ruin, but in the middle of a massive holiday celebration. It involves a teenager who said goodbye to his friends on a busy platform and stepped into a train carriage only to vanish into a labyrinth of high society secrets and institutional silence. It remains one of the most chilling disappearances in the history of the London Underground. On the night of November 5th, 1981, the streets of London were filled with the heavy smell of gunpowder and the sound of distant explosions. It was Guy Fawkes night, and thousands of people had gathered in the city's parks to watch the massive fireworks displays. 16-year-old Mark Allister stood on the crowded platform of King's Cross Station, laughing with a group of friends he had spent the day with. Mark was a tall, athletic teenager with a polite manner that reflected his upbringing. His father was a high-ranking diplomat stationed at the Australian High Commission, and the family lived in a grand house in a wealthy part of the city. Mark was responsible and well-traveled, and he was very familiar with the city's transit network. He checked his watch and saw it was getting late. The station was a chaotic maze of people. He said his goodbyes to his friends, telling them he would see them at school the following morning. The group watched as he stepped into a Piccadilly Line train heading south. The carriage was packed with commuters and revelers, many of them wearing colorful hats or carrying small bags of candy. Mark found a spot near the doors and leaned against the glass as the train roared into the dark tunnel ahead, leaving his friends behind. To his friends, everything about Mark's departure seemed completely routine. He was headed toward his home in the suburbs, a journey he had made dozens of times before. But as the train pulled away from the platform, one of his friends, a boy named Liam, noticed something slightly unusual. He saw an older, well-dressed man in a dark trench coat standing just a few feet behind Mark in the carriage, watching him intently. The man wasn't doing anything aggressive, but he was looking directly at the back of Mark's head with a level of focus that felt out of place in a crowded subway car. Liam assumed the man was just another commuter struggling for space or perhaps a family friend he didn't recognize. He watched the man for a second longer before the train disappeared from view, and then he turned to follow the rest of his friends out of the station. The underground air was warm and smelled of ozone and damp wool from the thousands of wet coats moving through the tunnels. Mark was a recognizable figure, always dressing in high-quality clothes that set him apart from the average London teenager. He carried a small leather satchel and looked like someone who had a clear destination and a sense of purpose. He was the type of kid who never got lost and always kept his word. By 11 o'clock that night, Mark's mother, Elizabeth, was pacing the floor of their living room in the quiet district of Kensington. Her son was usually very careful about his curfew, and he had promised to be home by 10:30 at the latest. She looked out the window at the flashes of light from the fireworks over the city. She told herself that the trains were likely delayed because of the holiday crowds and the heavy rain. It was a logical explanation that kept her calm for a few more minutes. She checked the kitchen clock again and decided to wait until 11:30 before calling his friends. In 1981, there were no cell phones, so once a person stepped into the city, they were effectively off the grid until they reached a landline. Elizabeth sat at the table and listened to the rain hitting the glass, hoping to hear the sound of his key. When midnight arrived and Mark still hadn't walked through the front door, Elizabeth began calling the homes of his friends. None of them had heard from him since they said goodbye at King's Cross. By 2 in the morning, the Allister family had contacted the local police. Because of Mark's father's high diplomatic status, the case was immediately escalated to Scotland Yard, the highest level of law enforcement in the city. The initial investigation focused on the logistics of the tube. Detectives interviewed station attendants and reviewed the train schedules for the Piccadilly line. They theorized that Mark might have decided to take a spontaneous detour to see more of the celebrations, or perhaps had met up with someone he knew secretly. But Mark's bedroom was untouched, and his savings account showed no activity, which broke the theory of him being a runaway. A week into the search, a witness came forward with a piece of information that shifted the entire direction of the case. A woman who had been standing on the platform at the Earl's Court station reported seeing a boy matching Mark's description. She said he was walking toward the exit, but he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a man in his late 50s who was wearing a dark trench coat and a gray felt hat, just as Liam had seen. The witness noted that the man had his hand firmly gripped around Mark's upper arm, guiding him through the crowd toward the stairs. She described the man's grip as being similar to a parent who was guiding a reluctant child, but she noticed that Mark looked confused and was staring straight ahead. She assumed at the time that the boy had gotten into trouble and was being taken home by an uncle or a teacher, so she didn't stop them. This detail changed everything for Scotland Yard. It suggested that Mark hadn't vanished by accident, but had been targeted and removed from the transit system by someone who knew how to blend into a crowd. Detectives began looking into reports of similar incidents across London. They discovered that several other young men from prominent families had reported being followed or approached by older men in transit hubs in the months prior. The investigation began to peel back the layers of a dark and hidden side of London high society. Rumors began to circulate within the police force about highly organized networks that specifically targeted the children of diplomats and wealthy businessmen. These groups were said to operate with a level of institutional protection that made them nearly impossible to infiltrate. Mark Allister, it seemed, had stepped off a train and into a trap. Detectives spent months tracking the identity of the well-dressed man. They created sketches based on the witness's description and circulated them to every police station in the country. They checked hotel registries and car rental records, looking for any foreign nationals who had been in London on Guy Fawkes night. They even looked into the possibility of a political abduction designed to pressure Mark's father at the Australian Commission. Every lead they followed eventually led to a dead end. The people they interviewed were either too afraid to speak or genuinely knew nothing about the shadow networks the police were investigating. The Allister family stayed in London for another year, hoping for a breakthrough, but the silence from the city was absolute. There were no ransom notes, no phone calls, and no evidence that Mark had ever left the Earl's Court Station area. Mark's father used his political influence to keep the case in the national news for as long as possible. He offered massive rewards for any information leading to his son's return, but the wall of silence remained unbroken. The case eventually transitioned from an active search into one of London's most famous cold cases. The boy who said goodbye to his friends on a crowded platform had simply evaporated into the London fog. Investigators would later remark that the most disturbing part of the witness's statement was how normal the two of them looked. The man and the boy were just another pair of people moving through the station on a busy holiday night. No one noticed the grip on Mark's arm until it was too late to act. The logic of the crowd provided the perfect cover for a crime that was executed with professional precision and total confidence. The case remains unsolved to this day. Mark Allister is still officially listed as a missing person, and his file at Scotland Yard is one of the thickest in their archives. His family eventually returned to Australia, but they left behind a permanent legacy of concern regarding the safety of the city's transit network. The mystery of what happened after Mark stepped onto that train remains a dark chapter in the history of the Underground. Today, the platforms at King's Cross and Earl's Court are monitored by hundreds of high-definition cameras, a response, in part, to the high-profile disappearances of the 1980s. But in 1981, the only record of Mark's final moments was the memory of a few friends and a single witness who didn't realize she was watching an abduction. The city moved on, but the Allister family never stopped looking for answers. While the tunnels of London kept their secrets hidden through the chaos of a crowd, our next story takes us to a very different kind of setting far away from the city. In this next case, the mystery takes us to the historic palm groves of the Spanish coast. It involves a woman who took a routine shortcut through Europe's largest forest of palm trees, only to encounter a killer who used a very specific and professional signature. The darkness there wasn't found in a subway tunnel, but beneath the long skeletal shadows of ancient trees. It is a story about how a single piece of industrial rope and an intricate agricultural knot became the only clues in a decades-long search for justice. We are moving from the damp, noisy streets of London to the quiet, sun-bleached paths of Alicante, where a different kind of predator was waiting in the shadows. On a warm Tuesday evening in October 1978, a 25-year-old factory worker named Elena Muro walked out of the heavy iron gates of a shoe warehouse in Elche, Spain. She had just finished a 10-hour shift, and her feet were heavy from the constant movement of the assembly line. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple that reflected off the whitewashed buildings. Elena adjusted the strap of her bag and looked toward the center of town. Elche is a unique place famous for housing the largest palm grove in all of Europe. Over 200,000 palm trees are packed into the city and its surrounding outskirts, creating a landscape that looks more like a North African oasis than a typical Spanish coastal town. To the locals, the trees are just a part of the background, a silent forest that provides shade and income. As she began her walk home, Elena reached a fork in the road. To the right was the main street, which was well lit, but added another 20 minutes to her commute. To the left was a narrow dirt path that cut directly through one of the older sections of the palm grove. She had taken this path hundreds of times during the day. At night, the grove changed. The light from the street lamps struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of fronds. Elena chose the dirt path. She rationalized that since it was a Tuesday and the weather was still quite warm, there would likely be other workers or harvesters moving through the area. She stepped off the pavement and onto the packed earth. The sound of her own footsteps was the only noise in the immediate area, muffled by the layer of dust and dried palm needles that coated the ground. Above her, the moon was nearly full, casting long shadows. These shadows were skeletal and rhythmic. Every few yards, a towering trunk would block the moonlight, creating a pocket of total darkness before the path opened up again. Elena walked at a steady pace, keeping her eyes on the white stones that lined the edge of the trail. She passed a small stone irrigation canal where the water was perfectly still. It acted like a black mirror, reflecting the silhouettes of the trees that leaned over the banks. About halfway through the grove, Elena noticed a slight change in the air. The smell of the city exhaust and cooking oil was replaced by the thick organic scent of damp soil and ripening dates. She also heard a sound coming from a dense cluster of palms about 30 yards to her right. It was a rhythmic rustling, like someone was dragging a heavy bag over the needles. She stopped and listened, her heart rate increasing just a small amount. She stood perfectly still for nearly 10 seconds. The rustling stopped. Elena looked toward the trees, but the density of the grove made it impossible to see more than a few feet into the brush. She told herself it was likely a stray dog, or perhaps one of the local harvesters working late to prepare for the morning market. It was harvest season after all, and the men who climbed the trees often worked at odd hours to avoid the midday heat. Satisfied with this logic, Elena continued walking. She was only 10 minutes from the edge of the grove where the path reconnected with her residential neighborhood. She could already see the dim yellow glow of the street lamps in the distance. She reached for her house keys in her pocket, wanting to be ready the moment she hit the pavement. As she rounded a sharp bend in the path, she saw a person standing near the base of a particularly thick palm tree. The figure was lean and dressed in dark utilitarian clothing. Elena slowed her pace, expecting a nod or a brief greeting, which was common in the tight-knit community of Elche. But the person didn't move. They were standing perfectly still, watching her approach. Elena felt a sharp prickle of unease at the back of her neck. She shifted her bag to her other shoulder and moved to the far edge of the path, giving the stranger as much space as possible. As she drew level with the figure, she realized they were holding something in their hands. It looked like a long, coiled length of rope. Before Elena could process why someone would be standing in the middle of a grove at night with a rope the stranger moved, they didn't shout or run. They stepped forward with a focused mechanical speed and swung a heavy object into the side of Elena's head. She collapsed onto the dirt path without making a sound. The next morning at 6:15, a veteran palm harvester named Jorge arrived at the grove to begin his daily rounds. He carried a set of specialized iron spikes that he strapped to his boots to help him climb the smooth trunks. Jorge was moving toward a section of trees that was due for pruning when he noticed a splash of color near a stone irrigation gate. It was a bright red scarf, partially buried under a pile of discarded palm fronds. Jorge walked over and pulled the scarf from the debris. As he did, he saw a human hand resting palm up on the ground. He dropped the scarf and backed away, his heavy boots kicking up clouds of dust. He didn't need to look any closer to know that the person was dead. He ran back toward the main road, waving down a passing delivery truck and shouting for the driver to call the civil guard. Within 30 minutes, the grove was swarming with officers. The lead investigator, a man named Detective Mendoza, arrived as the sun was beginning to hit the tops of the trees. He knelt beside Elena's body and noted that the scene was remarkably orderly. Elena had been moved several yards off the path and placed behind a thick cluster of trunks. She was bound at the wrists and ankles with a very specific type of heavy green industrial twine. A matching piece of twine had been used as a gag. Mendoza observed that the cause of death was manual strangulation, but the most striking detail was the rope work. The knots used to secure Elena's wrists were not standard loops. They were intricate, multi-layered hitches that required a high degree of technical skill to tie. Mendoza recognized the style immediately. These were agricultural knots specifically used by the men who secured heavy bundles of palm fronds for transport to the warehouses. The investigation immediately focused on the local harvesting community. There were nearly 300 men in Elche who had the physical strength and the specialized knowledge to tie those knots. Mendoza ordered a full audit of every farm and shipping warehouse in the district. He spent the next 3 weeks interviewing workers looking for anyone who had been absent on the night of the murder or who had a history of aggressive behavior. The detectives focused on a local man named Roberto, who worked as a warehouse foreman. Roberto was known for his incredible speed with rope and had been seen near the shoe factory on several occasions. When Mendoza brought him in for questioning, Roberto was calm. He admitted that he knew the path through the grove well, but he provided a solid alibi. On the night Elena vanished, he had been at a crowded tavern with several other workers. Mendoza checked the alibi, and it held up. Every other suspect the police identified followed a similar pattern. They either had multiple witnesses placing them elsewhere, or they were family men with no conceivable motive to harm a young factory worker. The town of Elche, usually loud and vibrant, fell into a heavy silence. The women who worked in the factories stopped taking the shortcuts, and the harvesters began working in pairs. Forensic technicians examined the twine found on Elena's body under a microscope. They discovered that the rope contained trace amounts of a very specific chemical fertilizer used only on a handful of private estates on the western edge of the city. This gave Mendoza a new lead. He dispatched teams to search the storage sheds of those estates looking for a matching spool of green twine. They found dozens of spools, but they all looked identical. The problem was that in 1978, rope was a commodity. Every farm used the same supplier, and every harvester used the same knots, because that was how they were taught by their fathers. The signature left by the killer was actually a collective signature of an entire industry. Without a witness or a unique physical clue, the intricate knots that had initially seemed like a breakthrough became a wall that blocked the investigation. Decades passed, and the murder of Elena Muro became a dark piece of local history. The palm grove continued to grow, eventually surrounding the site where she was found, with even denser foliage. In the late 1990s, a cold case team re-examined the evidence using modern DNA techniques. They hoped to find a profile on the green twine or Elena's clothing. But the samples had been poorly stored in the humid climate of the Mediterranean coast. The DNA had degraded to the point of being useless. The specialized knots remained the only concrete evidence of the killer's identity, but the men who had been in their prime in 1978 were now elderly or had passed away. The wall of silence that had protected the killer in the months after the crime had become a permanent part of the landscape. Elena's family eventually moved away, unable to live in the shadow of the trees. Investigators would later tell reporters that the most unsettling part of the case was the realization that the killer had likely never left the town. They believed he was a man who continued to work the groves for years, using those same professional knots every day to secure his harvest, knowing that his greatest skill was also the evidence of his crime. He had hidden his actions within the very fabric of the town's daily labor. The case remains officially unsolved. The dirt path through the grove is now a paved walkway with bright LED lights and security cameras at every entrance. But the locals still remember the story of the woman who took a shortcut through the palms and never came out. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most technical and specific clues are also the ones that are the easiest to hide in plain sight among a community of professionals. Elena Muro is buried in a small plot overlooking the city she worked in. Her headstone is simple, but every year on the anniversary of her death, a small coil of green industrial twine is found sitting on the grass nearby. No one knows who leaves it there, and the police have long since stopped investigating the gesture. While the mystery of the palm grove remains buried in the Spanish dust, our next story takes us to a very different kind of forest. In this next case, the setting is the dense and ancient Black Forest of Germany. It involves a teenager who stood by the side of a high-speed highway holding a handwritten cardboard sign, entirely unaware that the car that stopped for her would take her straight into the heart of the darkness. It is a story about a phantom driver and a discovery made by woodcutters that would take over a year to reach the light of day. On a warm Saturday afternoon in June 1976, a 17-year-old student named Lena Brandt stood in the kitchen of her family's apartment in Stuttgart, Germany. She was carefully folding a pair of jeans and placing them into a small canvas duffel bag. Lena was a responsible, organized teenager with bright eyes and a wide circle of friends. But today, her mind was focused on only one person, her boyfriend Felix, who lived about 60 miles away in the town of Lampertheim. Felix had recently moved there for a summer internship, and they had been counting down the days until they could see each other again. Lena's parents were at work, and the apartment was quiet, filled only with the faint sound of a radio playing in the background and the distant hum of the city through the open windows. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusted her yellow cotton shirt, and felt a surge of excitement. This was supposed to be a simple, routine weekend trip. To save money for their dates, Lena decided she would hitchhike most of the way. In the mid-1970s, this was a completely ordinary way for young people in Europe to travel. It was considered a social norm, almost a rite of passage for students, and Lena had done it several times before without any issues. She grabbed a thick piece of brown cardboard from a delivery box and a black permanent marker. In bold, clean letters, she wrote the word Lampertheim across the center. She capped the marker, noting the sharp chemical scent of the ink that lingered in the air for a moment. Lena tossed the sign into her bag, grabbed her keys, and locked the front door behind her. She walked toward the outskirts of Stuttgart, heading for a specific highway slip road that led onto the Autobahn. The sun was high, and the weather was perfect for travel. She reached the slip road around 2:30 in the afternoon and took her position on the shoulder. Lena stood near the edge of the asphalt, holding her sign up with a confident smile. Several witnesses would later remember seeing her there. They described a girl who looked perfectly at home, not a traveler in distress, but someone with a clear destination. The traffic on the Autobahn was heavy that day, a constant stream of cars and industrial trucks rushing toward the northern corridor. For nearly 20 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic whoosh of vehicles passing at high speed. Around 3 o'clock, a dark-colored sedan slowed down as it approached the slip road. The driver pulled onto the gravel shoulder a few yards ahead of Lena. She watched as the passenger side window rolled down. From the distance, she couldn't see the driver's face clearly due to the glare of the sun on the windshield, but the car looked well-maintained and modern. Lena picked up her duffel bag, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and walked toward the idling vehicle. She reached the car and leaned down to speak through the window. The interaction was brief. Witnesses saw her nod, smile, and then pull the handle of the door. She climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door with a solid thud. The car sat for a few seconds, its blinker signaling a return to traffic, and then it merged back into the flow of the Autobahn. To anyone watching it was an entirely unremarkable moment. Lena was gone, heading toward what she thought was a weekend with Felix. Felix spent that evening sitting on the porch of his boarding house in Lampertheim, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He expected Lena to arrive by dinner time, given the typical pace of hitchhiking along that route. When 7 o'clock turned into 9, he began to feel a slight sense of unease. He rationalized it by thinking that perhaps she had struggled to catch a second ride once she got off the main highway, or maybe she had decided to take a bus for the final leg. By midnight, the unease had turned into a cold, hollow anxiety. Felix walked to a nearby phone booth and called Lena's house, but there was no answer. He assumed she was already on the road and that they had simply missed each other. He spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, listening to every car that passed on the street outside. When the sun rose on Sunday morning and Lena's side of the bed remained empty, Felix called her parents. They hadn't heard from her either. The Brandt family immediately contacted the Baden-Württemberg State Police. Initially, the officers offered the same everyday logic that many families heard during that era. They suggested that Lena might have decided to take a spontaneous trip to the coast with friends, or that she and Felix had simply had a misunderstanding. But Lena's mother insisted this was impossible. Lena was a girl of her word. She never missed a check-in, and she had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A massive appeal was launched across the region. Police focused their efforts on the Autobahn corridors, interviewing truck drivers and commuters who frequented the Stuttgart to Lampertheim route. They distributed thousands of flyers featuring Lena's photo and a description of her yellow shirt and duffel bag. They even checked the logs of roadside rest stops and gas stations. But despite the thousands of eyes on the road, that Saturday, the dark sedan and its driver seemed to have vanished. For the next several months, the investigation hit a wall of silence. There were no sightings, no phone calls, and no activity on Lena's small savings account. The seasons changed, and the vibrant greens of the German summer gave way to the heavy gray dampness of autumn. The Brandt family kept their daughter's room exactly as it was on the day she left, waiting for a knock at the door that never came. The silence in the house became a permanent, suffocating presence. 16 months later, in October 1977, the mystery finally broke in a way no one expected. A team of woodcutters was working in a dense, isolated section of the forest near the town of Bensheim. This area was miles away from any major highway, tucked deep into the heart of the Odenwald Mountains. The woodcutters were clearing a patch of old-growth pines when one of them noticed something unusual near the base of a jagged rock formation. The worker saw a small rectangular object lying in a shallow ditch partially covered by layers of decaying pine needles and forest debris. He reached down and pulled it out, noticing it was a piece of waterlogged cardboard. The edges were frayed and the material was soft from months of rain, but as he wiped away the dirt, he could still make out the faint black ink of a handwritten word. It said Lampertheim. He looked toward the rock formation and saw a shallow depression in the earth. He signaled for his coworkers to stop their saws. Together, they began to carefully clear away the thick layer of needles. Just a few inches beneath the surface, they made a grim discovery. It was a set of skeletal remains partially tangled in the roots of the trees. There were remnants of fabric, a faded yellow shirt, and a pair of blue denim jeans. The woodcutters didn't touch anything else. They marked the spot and hiked back to their truck to call the authorities. Forensic pathologists arrived at the remote site the following day. The logic of the burial was immediately clear to them. This wasn't a place where a traveler would end up by accident. The site was so far from the road and so well hidden by the topography of the forest that only someone with intimate knowledge of the local trails could have found it in the dark. Lena had been carried or led into the deepest part of the woods, far beyond the reach of the Autobahn's lights. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, after 16 months in the damp soil, the medical examiner could not determine an exact cause of death. There were no obvious fractures to the skull or ribs, leading investigators to believe she had likely been strangled or suffocated. The duffel bag was found a few yards away, tucked inside a hollow log. Her clothes were still inside, neatly folded just as she had left them in Stuttgart. Her wallet was there too, but the cash was missing. The discovery of the body shifted the investigation from a missing persons case to a homicide, but the trail was already cold. Detectives re-examined the highway logs from June 1976, looking for any reports of suspicious vehicles near the Stuttgart slip road. They looked into local residents in the Bensheim area who had a history of violence, theorizing that the killer might be a local Black Forest predator who used the highway as a convenient source for victims. They interrogated hundreds of truck drivers and transient workers, but without a license plate or a clear description of the driver, the phantom of the Autobahn remained a shadow. The case became a dark piece of regional history, often cited in German media as a warning about the dangers of the hitchhiking culture. It exposed a terrifying reality that the very modern high-speed infrastructure of the country could be used by a predator to snatch someone and disappear into the ancient silence of the trees. Lena Brandt was eventually laid to rest in a quiet cemetery in Stuttgart. Her boyfriend Felix would later tell reporters that he couldn't stop thinking about the cardboard sign. He realized that the driver had looked at that sign, known exactly where Lena wanted to go, and used that information to gain her trust before taking her in the opposite direction. The sign that was meant to bring her to him had instead acted as a beacon for a killer. The investigation remains officially open as a cold case, but decades have passed without a single credible lead. The dark sedan was never found, and the driver never stepped forward. Today, the slip road where Lena stood is still there now, monitored by high-tech traffic cameras that didn't exist in the 70s. But the Black Forest remains as dense and silent as ever, keeping the secret of what happened during those final miles tucked beneath the pine needles. While the ancient forests of Germany kept their secrets through depth and shadow, our next story involves a mystery that took place in a small, tight-knit community on the coast of Canada. In this next case, the darkness didn't come from a stranger on a highway, but from a wall of silence that protected a group of men for nearly half a century. It is a story about a young man who went for a routine walk and was snatched by a phantom car in broad daylight. The disappearance of Billy Roach remains one of Nova Scotia's most haunting transit mysteries, involving a case of mistaken identity and a small town that refused to speak. We are moving from the deep woods of Europe to the fog-swept shores of Cape Breton, where a single bridge over a tidal river became the site of a disappearance that would haunt a community for generations. It is a story about the heavy weight of secrets in a place where everyone knows your name. On the night of September 5th, 1979, 19-year-old Bobby Reed was leaning against a wood-paneled station wagon outside a popular diner in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray and fried potatoes, a typical late summer evening in this corner of Canada. Bobby was a popular local youth known for his easy smile and his habit of helping neighbors haul in their heavy groceries. He had spent the last few hours laughing with his friends, talking about the upcoming hockey season and his plans for the future. Around 10:30, Bobby decided it was time to head home. He didn't live far, just a short 20-minute walk down a coastal road and across a bridge that spans Sydney Creek. He waved to his friends, adjusted his denim jacket, and stepped into the cooling night air alone. The road was quiet, lit only by the occasional amber glow of a street lamp and the moon reflecting off the tidal river. Bobby walked at a steady pace, his boots thudding softly on the pavement. He passed the local hardware store and a row of darkened houses, eventually reaching the entrance of the Sydney Creek Bridge. The bridge was a heavy wooden and steel structure that creaked rhythmically as the tide pulled the water out toward the Atlantic. Bobby reached the midpoint of the bridge when he noticed a set of headlights slowing down behind him. In a small town like this, a car slowing down usually meant a friend or a neighbor was offering a lift. Bobby stopped and turned around, expecting to see a familiar face. But the car wasn't a local truck. It was a dark, four-door sedan with tinted windows that hadn't been washed in a very long time. The sedan came to a full stop just a few feet away from Bobby. The engine was idling high, emitting a low vibrating hum that seemed to compete with the sound of the rushing water below. Bobby stood there for a few seconds, waiting for someone to roll down a window. He probably figured the driver was lost and needed directions to the highway. This was the most logical explanation in a community where everyone knew your name. However, the back door of the sedan suddenly swung open. Two men stepped out with a level of aggression that immediately broke the logic of the peaceful evening. They didn't say a word. They didn't ask for directions or call out a name. They simply moved toward Bobby with a practiced mechanical speed. Bobby tried to back away his hands, coming up in a defensive gesture, but he was trapped against the heavy wooden railing of the bridge. A witness named George, who lived in a house overlooking the creek, was standing on his porch having a late-night cigarette. He watched the scene unfold with a sense of confused detachment. He saw the struggle, the way the two men grabbed Bobby by his jacket and forced him toward the open car door. George assumed at the time that he was watching a group of teenagers playing a rough prank on one of their friends. He watched as Bobby's legs kicked out, trying to find purchase on the asphalt before the men finally shoved him into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud that George could hear clearly from his porch. The sedan didn't peel away. It simply accelerated at a steady, calm pace, crossing the rest of the bridge and disappearing into the darkness of the coastal road on the other side. George stood on his porch for another minute, waiting to hear the sound of laughter or see the car turn around. But the road remained silent. He eventually went back inside, rationalizing that if something were truly wrong, there would have been more noise, a scream, or the sound of tires screeching. In the quiet culture of the Maritimes, people often preferred to believe the best about their neighbors until they were forced to believe the worst. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Bobby's mother, Martha, was standing in her kitchen staring at a bowl of cereal she hadn't touched. Bobby had never missed his curfew, and he had certainly never stayed out all night without calling. She walked to his bedroom and saw the bed was still perfectly made. The denim jacket he had been wearing was missing, along with the set of house keys he usually kept on a brass ring in the hallway. Martha began calling the parents of Bobby's friends. They all confirmed that he had left the diner alone at 10:30 and intended to walk straight home. By 10 in the morning, Martha was at the local RCMP station, her hands trembling as she described her son to the officers. Initially, the police offered the standard everyday logic, maybe Bobby had met a girl or decided to take a spontaneous road trip to Halifax. But as the hours turned into days, that logic began to fail. Bobby had no history of running away, and he had left all of his money and extra clothes in his room. The RCMP launched a ground search, deploying dozens of volunteers and divers to the Sydney Creek area. They combed the rugged coastline and the dense woods surrounding the bridge, looking for a discarded shoe or a piece of denim. They found nothing. The investigation eventually reached George, the witness, on the porch. When he described the dark sedan and the struggle on the bridge, the case shifted from a missing person inquiry to a suspected homicide. Detectives focused their attention on a local group of bootleggers and small-time drug dealers who operated in the shadows of the community. Rumors began to circulate that Bobby had been the victim of a tragic case of mistaken identity. The theory was that the men in the sedan were looking for a local informant who had been providing information to the police about illegal shipments coming into the harbor. This informant was roughly the same age and build as Bobby and was known to frequent the same diner. On a foggy night on a dimly lit bridge, Bobby Reed had simply been the first person the hit squad encountered who fit the general description of their target. Investigators began knocking on doors in the neighborhoods where the bootleggers lived. They expected people to be outraged that an innocent kid had been snatched, but instead they were met with a wall of silence. In Cape Breton, the code of loyalty to the community was often stronger than the commitment to the law. People who clearly knew the identity of the driver or the owners of the dark sedan simply looked away. They gave vague answers, claimed they were asleep at the hour of the abduction, or insisted they hadn't seen a dark car in weeks. The police knew they were being lied to. They could see the hesitation in the eyes of the witnesses and the way people would share strange, knowing glances across their kitchen tables. But without a confession or a body, the RCMP had no legal leverage to force the truth out into the light. Months later, a small piece of evidence was found by a fisherman nearly 30 miles down the coast. It was a brass keyring with a set of house keys attached to it, snagged in a heavy piece of kelp. Martha Reed identified them as Bobby's keys. The discovery suggested that Bobby had been taken out to sea or driven to a remote part of the coastline where the Atlantic could swallow the evidence of a crime. Despite this, Find the Trail went entirely cold. The men who had been in the sedan that night likely went back to their daily lives, continuing to work on the docks or in the local shops, knowing that their neighbors were keeping their secret. The wall of silence proved to be more effective than any forensic cleanup. Bobby Reed became a ghost, a name whispered in the local pubs but never spoken in a courtroom. Decades passed, and the mystery of Sydney Creek remained an open wound for the community. Every few years, a new lead would surface a deathbed confession or a rumor of a car buried in a backyard, but the police were never able to find a body or enough physical evidence to make an arrest. The case of Bobby Reed transitioned from a crime into a piece of maritime tragedy, a warning about the heavy cost of secrets. Martha Reed lived in the same house until she passed away in the early 2000s. She never changed the locks on her front door, holding on to the irrational hope that Bobby might one day find his way back across the bridge. She told local reporters that the hardest part wasn't knowing he was dead, but knowing that the men who took him were likely still walking the same streets as she was. Today, the bridge over Sydney Creek has been replaced by a modern concrete span with bright lights and heavy traffic. The diner is gone, replaced by a generic gas station. But the story of the dark sedan remains. It is a reminder that in tight-knit communities, the darkness doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it is cultivated and protected from within, hidden behind a polite refusal to speak. Bobby Reed is still officially listed as a missing person, his file sitting in a cabinet in a regional headquarters. While the silence of a small Canadian town kept a killer's identity hidden for nearly half a century, our next story takes us to a setting that is just as remote, though the crime was solved through a much more rapid and forensic-driven investigation. We are moving from the Atlantic coast to the volcanic plains of New Zealand. In this next case, the mystery involves an isolated general store at a lonely highway junction known as Wade's Corner. It features a woman who spent decades as a lifeline for rural workers, only to encounter a pair of drifting predators who were willing to end a life for a handful of cash. It is a story about a brave woman's final moments and how a single set of tire tread patterns in the dust eventually led to justice. In the late afternoon of October 18, 1976, the shadows began to stretch across the volcanic plateau of the North Island in New Zealand. This part of the country is a high, rugged landscape where the wind often carries a fine grit from the gravel roads that cut through the scrubland. For miles in every direction, there was nothing but low-lying brush and the occasional stand of pine trees. 49-year-old Martha Rose stood behind the wooden counter of her general store at the Range Cross Junction. She was using a damp cloth to wipe down the glass display cases that held meat pies and assorted candies. It was a rhythmic, satisfying task that signaled the end of another long day. Martha had run this outpost for nearly 20 years, and she knew the travel patterns of almost every driver in the region. The store was more than just a place to buy fuel or bread. It was the only point of contact for workers moving between the timber mills and the hydroelectric projects further south. Martha lived in a small apartment attached to the back of the building, and she took pride in being the person people counted on when their engines overheated or when they simply needed a friendly face after a long haul. Business had been steady through the morning, but as the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks, the junction became quiet. Martha reached over to flip the switch for the fluorescent bulb that hung over the petrol pumps outside. It flickered a few times before settling into a steady, low hum. She noticed that the gravel in the parking lot was dry and white, reflecting the last of the daylight like a sheet of paper. She checked the clock on the wall and saw it was just after 7 in the evening. Typically, she would lock the front doors in another 30 minutes, but she decided to leave them open a little longer just in case one of the late shift mill workers needed tobacco. Martha leaned back against the shelves of canned goods and watched a hawk circling high above the plateau. The stillness felt complete and safe. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by the sound of a vehicle approaching from the north. Martha could hear the gravel crunching under heavy tires long before the car actually came into view. She straightened her apron and put on a welcoming expression, assuming it was a regular customer. A dusty older sedan pulled up to the pumps and came to a halt under the yellow light of the bulb. 2 young men stepped out of the vehicle. They looked to be in their early 20s and were dressed in heavy work jackets that were stained with mud and grease. Martha watched through the window as they stood by the car for a moment, talking quietly to one another. She figured they were likely transients looking for seasonal work at the mills, a common sight during the spring months on the island. One of the men stayed by the driver's side door while the other walked toward the store's entrance. He moved with a slight limp, and his eyes were focused on the ground as he pulled the heavy wooden door open. Martha greeted him with a polite nod as he stepped inside. The air he brought in was cold and smelled faintly of wood smoke. He didn't return her greeting, but instead began walking down the aisles. He stopped at the back of the store and picked up a loaf of bread and a couple of tins of sardines. Martha watched him, thinking he just seemed tired from a long drive. She rationalized his silence as exhaustion. The second man eventually entered as well, leaving the car door wide open and the engine idling. He walked straight to the counter and asked Martha if she had any maps of the mountain roads. As Martha reached under the counter to find a local road guide, she noticed the man's hands were shaking. She figured he was probably just cold, given that the temperature on the plateau drops rapidly once the sun goes down. She placed the map on the glass top and started to ring up the food the first man had brought forward. The total came to less than $5. She waited for the man to reach for his wallet. Instead of pulling out cash, the man at the counter reached into the folds of his heavy jacket. Martha expected him to produce a checkbook or perhaps a handful of loose change. But when his hand emerged, he was holding a short-barreled shotgun. The barrel was dark and worn, and it was pointed directly at Martha's chest. The logic of the transaction vanished, replaced by a sudden, heavy stillness. The man demanded the contents of the cash register. His voice was low and surprisingly steady. Martha froze for a second, her hands still resting on the keys of the register. She looked at the man's face and saw no hesitation there. She had a silent alarm button installed under the counter, a device she had never once had to use. She began to shift her weight, her fingers moving toward the hidden switch. The man with the shotgun saw her move. He didn't shout a warning or ask her to stop. He simply stepped closer and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The sound of the blast was deafening inside the small wood-paneled room, shattering the glass of the display case and knocking Martha backward into the shelves. She never had the chance to scream or explain that she was willing to give them the money. The 2 men didn't stop to check if she was alive. They scrambled behind the counter, their boots slipping on the blood and broken glass. They grabbed a small stack of bills and a handful of silver coins from the till, totaling less than $80. They ran out the front door, jumped back into the idling sedan, and peeled out of the lot, leaving a thick cloud of dust hanging in the night air. For nearly an hour, the store was silent. The only sound was the hum of the petrol pumps and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Martha lay on the floor among the scattered cans of peaches and peas. A passing truck driver eventually pulled in for fuel and noticed the front door standing open and the lights on inside. When he stepped into the store and saw the destruction, he ran to his radio. Local police from the nearest township arrived by 9 o'clock. The lead investigator was a man named Sergeant Miller, who had known Martha for years. He stood in the middle of the store and looked at the single spent shotgun shell lying on the floor. It was a standard 16-gauge shell commonly used for hunting small game. Miller noted that the killers had been messy, leaving behind clear evidence. Initially, the police theorized that this was the work of a professional gang targeting remote outposts. They assumed the killers were already halfway to Auckland by now. However, Miller walked out to the parking lot and knelt in the white dust. Because the air was so still and the ground was so dry, the tire tracks left by the sedan were perfectly preserved. He noticed a very specific wear pattern on the tire. Miller realized that these weren't professionals. Professionals wouldn't be driving a vehicle with a bald, uneven tire on the rugged roads of the plateau. He ordered a massive dragnet across the volcanic plains, contacting every local farm and timber camp. He told the searchers to look for an older, dark sedan with a distinctive tire tread. He also told them to look for anyone who seemed to be drifting. By daybreak, a patrol officer spotted a vehicle matching the description parked in a patch of scrubland about 40 miles south of the junction. The car was empty, but there was a trail of discarded snack wrappers leading toward a small campfire. The two men were found sleeping in their jackets, the shotgun lying between them on a piece of tarp. They were arrested and taken to the station. Under questioning, the men admitted to the robbery, but claimed they had only intended to scare Martha. They were transients who had been drifting through the North Island for months, taking odd jobs and sleeping in their car. They had run out of money and decided that the isolated store was an easy target. They said they panicked when Martha moved her hand, assuming she was reaching for a weapon. The trial was a major event for the quiet region. The community was outraged that a woman who had been a lifeline for so many had been killed for such a meager amount of cash. The two men were eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Martha's store remained closed for several months before being sold, but the Range Cross Junction was never quite the same for the workers. Martha Rose is remembered as a pillar of the Rangataiki community. Her death led to a complete overhaul of security for rural businesses across New Zealand, with many installing the very alarms she had tried to reach. Today, the petrol pumps at the junction are modern and automated, but the local drivers still slow down as they approach the crossroad, thinking of the woman who sat behind that counter. Investigators would later say that the tire treads were the most fortunate break in the case. If it had rained that night, the tracks would have been washed away in minutes, and the drifters likely would have disappeared into the timber camps. The volcanic dust had held on to the evidence just long enough to bring them to justice. Martha's story serves as a lesson in the vulnerability of those in isolation. Range Cross remains a lonely spot surrounded by the vast plateau. The wind still kicks up the white grit, and the mountain peaks still cast long shadows over the scrubland. While the justice system eventually closed the file on Martha Rose, the mystery of why such violence found its way to a quiet country store remains. It is a reminder that at any crossroads, a routine evening can turn into something permanent. We've looked at 12 stories tonight, each one a testament to these strange and mysterious forces that operate in the background of our everyday lives. From the wool sheds of Australia to the transit hubs of London, these cases show us that the logic we rely on is often more fragile than we think. Thank you for listening and for joining us on this journey through the shadows of the world's endurance. Please remember to subscribe and stay tuned for more stories like these, delivered several times every week. As we close this chapter, consider the people in your own community who work in the quiet, isolated spots we often take for granted. You never know what secrets the silence might be hiding. Good night and stay safe out there in the dark. Reflecting on these 12 cases, we see a recurring pattern where the most mundane settings become the backdrop for something entirely irregular. From the quiet wool sheds of Australia to the crowded transit platforms of London, the logic we use to navigate our daily lives is often more fragile than we care to admit. These stories are not just about crimes, but about the specific way that reality bends when gravity and laws are ignored by someone in the shadows. In the case of Kyle Arris, the detail that lingers is the beige sedan idling on the shoulder with its hazard lights pulsing. It was a professional-looking setup meant to act as a distraction. It reminds us that an offer of help or a simple mechanical failure can be a calculated maneuver. The industrial wool press used to hide his body shows how a killer will use the heavy, familiar tools of a local trade to mask the logistics of a very violent execution. The sheer physical impossibility of a single person forcing Kyle into that machine suggests a level of coordination that the local police were never able to penetrate. It is a story that turned a piece of farming equipment into a permanent symbol of rural anxiety. Even 40 years later, the motive remains as hidden as Kyle was that morning. The lesson is that isolation in the outback isn't just about the distance between houses, but about the silence that follows a sudden decision. Moving to the Tuscan hills, the foreman Giovanni was found in a fermentation vat where the very thing he spent his life creating was used to erase the evidence of his murder. The high acidity of the grape juice acted as a natural solvent, scrubbing the body of DNA and fingerprints. This case teaches us that nature itself can sometimes collaborate with a perpetrator, turning a beautiful harvest into a forensic desert where the truth remains submerged beneath thousands of gallons of wine. The Carabinieri were faced with a community that valued its internal secrets more than the national law. Because the estate was secure, the killer was almost certainly a colleague or a neighbor, someone who shared a meal with Giovanni only hours before the attack. The code of silence in rural Italy, known as omerta, acted as a second layer of concealment that was just as effective as the acidic grapes. It is a reminder that trust is often the most dangerous thing we carry into a cellar. The locker babies phenomenon in Tokyo revealed a deep social trauma hidden behind the neon lights of Shibuya Station. It wasn't just a series of individual crimes, but a national epidemic driven by a total fear of social ostracization. The red plastic key tag found in locker number 3 served as a tiny, mundane anchor that eventually pulled the truth into the light. It highlights how the anonymity of a massive crowd can provide a false sense of security for those who are desperate. The investigation into the young woman named Yumi was a textbook example of meticulous detective work. By following a single thread from a boarding house key, the authorities were able to uncover a person who had been consumed by the pressure to be normal. Her confession forced the Japanese government to change its laws and its infrastructure. It is a rare instance where a private tragedy resulted in a public shift that likely saved hundreds of other children in the years that followed. The assassination on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C. shattered the logic of safe boundaries. Arthur Varga believed that the laws of the American capital acted as a physical shield, but the men tracking his sedan didn't care about diplomatic immunity or international borders. The shaped charge placed under his feet was a military-grade message delivered in broad daylight. It serves as a reminder that political tensions can follow a person across an ocean, turning a commute into a target. The FBI's ability to track the hit squad across multiple continents exposed the terrifying reality of Operation Condor. It showed that foreign dictatorships were actively deploying agents inside the United States to silence their critics. The luxury sedan, sitting shredded in the middle of a grand roundabout, remains one of the most explosive images in the history of the capital. The case was eventually solved, but it took decades for the high-ranking officials to be held accountable. In the Netherlands, the disappearance of Elias Bakker and his brilliant orange Beetle remains a riddle of environmental chaos. Despite the use of advanced naval sonar and intensive dredging, the lowlands kept the vehicle hidden for decades. It shows how the dense fog of the North Sea can swallow a multi-ton object without leaving a single tire track. The small bank withdrawal made days later suggests that the logic of a simple accident was wrong, but the canals never spoke. The frustration of the Bakker family is a common theme in these missing persons cases. The lack of a crash site or a body allowed for decades of irrational hope and painful speculation. Elias Bakker and his Clementine orange car became a piece of modern folklore, a story told to young drivers about the dangers of the canal roads. The lesson here is that even the most high-visibility objects can become invisible when the weather and the landscape decide to keep a secret. The Saône-et-Loire region of France was haunted for 40 years by the phantom of the A6. The persistence of Maria Rossi and the association of grieving mothers is perhaps the most powerful lesson in these scripts. They refused to accept the bureaucratic indifference of the state. When DNA finally identified Paul Jerry as the gardener who lived only miles away, it exposed the frightening reality that a predator can spend decades raising a family while being a source of local fear. Paul Jarry was a man who attended local festivals and paid his taxes, a person who was described by his neighbors as polite and helpful. His ability to blend into the fabric of everyday life for 30 years is more unsettling than the crimes themselves. The mother's victory in 1986 proved that the justice system can be forced to work if someone is willing to carry the files. It is a story about the weight of persistence against a system that prefers easy answers. At the ruins of Ayutthaya, the night watchman Prosert was executed by men who valued a piece of the past more than a human life. The syndicate's logistics were professional right down to the shipping crate labeled as garden replicas. However, their speed became their downfall. They didn't bother to clean the blood from the 13th century gold Buddha before sealing it. It is a reminder that even the most organized criminal networks often fail because of a single messy oversight. The recovery of the relic in a Bangkok warehouse prevented a national treasure from disappearing into a private collection in Europe. While the actual killers were never identified, the dismantling of their smuggling route was a major blow to the art underworld. Prosert is now remembered as the final guardian of the temple, a man who stayed at his post until the end. His death serves as a lesson in the high stakes of international artifact trafficking and the value of history. The disappearance of Mark Allister on Guy Fawkes Night is a chilling example of vanishing in plain sight. 16-year-old Mark stepped onto a packed train carriage and was guided away by a well-dressed man whom witnesses assumed was a relative. The chaos of a national holiday provided the perfect shroud for an abduction. It highlights the vulnerability of the normalcy bias, where people see something unusual but rationalize it with everyday logic until it is far too late to act. Scotland Yard's investigation into the elite networks of London high society hit a wall that was likely built by institutional corruption. Because Mark's father was a diplomat, the case had international implications, yet no trace of the boy was ever found. The image of the crowded tile platform, illuminated by flickering yellow lights, is a permanent part of the city's transit history. It is a story that warns us that the most dangerous places are sometimes the most crowded ones. Anita Muro's walk through the palm groves of Elche ended because of a killer who used his professional skills as a signature. The intricate agricultural knots tied with green industrial twine were a fingerprint of an entire industry. The case shows how a tight-knit community can become a wall of silence, protecting a neighbor over a victim. Decades later, the twine remains the only evidence, a permanent artifact of a Tuesday night shortcut that was taken with a false sense of security. The forensic focus on the chemical fertilizer found in the rope gave the police a lead that should have solved the case, yet every spool of twine in the district looked identical. It is a reminder that technical clues are only useful if they are unique. The killer in Elche likely lived a full life, using those same professional knots every day at work, knowing that his greatest skill was also the record of his crime. The palms of Spain continued to cast shadows over an open file. In Germany, Lena Brandt's hitchhiking trip ended in a remote part of the Black Forest that could only be reached by someone who knew the land intimately. The waterlogged cardboard sign found by woodcutters 16 months later is a visceral image of a failed journey. It exposes the distance between the modern high-speed Autobahn and the ancient silent woods. The driver used Lena's own destination to gain her trust, turning her hopeful sign into a beacon for her execution. The state of decomposition made a cause of death impossible to determine, but the remote burial site left no doubt of foul play. The phantom of the Autobahn was never identified, despite a massive appeal to the trucking community. Lena's story is often used as a warning to travelers in Europe, a reminder that the person who pulls over to help might be looking for a target rather than a passenger. The Black Forest remains a silent witness to a Saturday afternoon interaction. Bobby Reed's abduction at Sydney Creek in Canada is a tragic lesson in the dangers of mistaken identity. Two men in a dark sedan snatched a popular youth from a bridge, likely believing he was someone else entirely. The code of loyalty in the maritime town prevented anyone from naming the owners of the car, even as the Reed family waited decades for an answer. It shows how a community's silence can be more damaging than the crime itself, leaving a family trapped in confusion. The discovery of Bobby's house keys in a piece of kelp 30 miles down the coast was the only closure the family ever received. It suggested a journey out into the Atlantic that no one witnessed. The men who took him likely went back to their jobs on the docks the next morning, passing Martha Reed on the street without a word. The Wall of Silence in Cape Breton is a reminder that in small towns, the darkness is often cultivated and protected from within by those we know. Finally, the murder of Martha Rose at Wade's Corner in New Zealand was a crime of sudden, senseless violence. She was a lifeline for the rural workers of the volcanic plateau, executed for less than $80. The investigators' success came from the white volcanic dust that held onto the tire tread patterns of the killer's sedan. It is a reminder that even in the most isolated outposts, the ground can sometimes keep a record of an event long enough for the law to respond. The tire treads were a fortunate break that wouldn't have existed if it had rained that night. The two transients were caught because they were overconfident in the isolation of the plateau. Martha Rose's death led to a complete overhaul of security for rural businesses, but the Range Cross Junction never regained its sense of peace. The case serves as a lesson in the vulnerability of those who provide a service in the quiet corners of the world far from immediate help. Looking at all these stories together, we see that silence is often the most significant obstacle to justice. Whether it is the institutional apathy of the French police or the maritime code of Cape Breton, the truth is frequently known by someone who chooses not to speak. These cases are often resolved only when that silence is broken by a persistent mother, a new forensic test, or a single messy mistake made by a perpetrator who has grown too comfortable in their own routine. Another recurring theme is the failure of logic during the initial moments of an irregular event. Witnesses in London, Canada, and Germany all saw something unusual but rationalized it as a joke or a routine interaction. This normalcy bias is a powerful tool for a predator, allowing them to operate in the middle of a crowd or on a busy highway. It is the mechanism that keeps us from intervening when a person is being guided away or forced into a car in broad daylight. We also see how the physical environment dictates the nature of a crime and its investigation. The acidic grapes of Italy, the deep canals of the Netherlands, and the dense needles of the Black Forest all acted as concealment mechanisms. These landscapes don't just provide a setting, they become active participants in the mystery. A crime is never just an interaction between two people. It is an interaction between a perpetrator, a victim, and the physics of the place. The transition of forensic technology from 1975 to the present day is the bridge that eventually closed several of these files. DNA evidence found on a sleeve in France shows that the record of a crime is often permanent, even if it is invisible to the eyes of the original detectives. The cases that remain unsolved are usually those where the physical evidence was either destroyed by nature or lost through poor storage over the course of several decades. There is a specific kind of weight to the stories that end in a wall of silence. When a community chooses to protect a killer, they are not just hiding a name, they are transforming their town into a place where the logic of safety no longer applies. In Elche and Cape Breton, the perpetrators likely continued to walk the same paths as the families of their victims. This proximity creates a secondary layer of trauma that lasts far longer than the initial act of violence. The value of these stories lies in their ability to remind us to pay attention to these subtle anomalies. The idling car with hazard lights on the loose seal on a wine vat, or the faint smell coming from a transit locker were all warnings. They were small breaks in the fabric of an ordinary day. While we cannot live our lives in a state of constant suspicion, understanding the mechanism of how these events begin can help us recognize when the world has drifted out of alignment. In the end, these 12 individuals were simply trying to finish a shift travel home or help a neighbor. They were operating under the assumption that the world is a predictable place governed by shared rules. The mysteries they left behind are a testament to the fact that those rules are occasionally set aside by someone in the darkness. We tell their stories not to focus on the outcome, but to honor the lives that were interrupted by the strange and the mysterious. As we finish looking at these cases, it is clear that the most effective investigators are often not the ones with the most resources, but the ones with the most persistence. The mothers of the A6 victims proved that the truth can be forced out of the shadows if someone is willing to carry the files for 40 years. Their victory is a reminder that even when the trail is cold and the witnesses are silent, a single dedicated voice can eventually shatter the logic of a phantom. We should also consider the people who work in the isolated, quiet spots we often take for granted. The night watchmen, the store owners at remote junctions, and the vineyard foremen are the guardians of our infrastructure. Their vulnerability is a byproduct of their service to the community. When that service is met with violence, the impact is felt by everyone who relies on those outposts. The death of Martha Rose didn't just end a life, it closed a vital point of contact. Finally, we are left with the images of the objects that remained behind. The bright orange beetle, the cardboard sign with Lampertheim written in marker, and the red plastic key tag are the physical remnants of an unfinished journey. They are mundane items that took on a massive importance once their owners vanished. They remind us that the evidence of our lives is often found in the small things we carry in our pockets or park under a leafless oak tree on a foggy night. Thank you for joining us as we walk through these 12 cases from around the globe. Each one offers a different perspective on the endurance of a mystery and the slow process of finding the truth. As you go about your own routine tomorrow, keep an eye on the details that feel slightly out of place. The world is full of logic, but it is also full of shadows, and sometimes the only thing separating the two is the attention we pay to the silence. Good night.